Chapter 744. In the spacious minister's office on the top floor of the Ministry of National Defense building, the spring scenery in the distant alleys struggled to pass through the distance and projected a pitiful amount of light onto the glass. Minister Zhou calmly put down his teacup and rubbed his nose that had a red mark because of the glasses. He smiled and said, "You must know that some people in the government are questioning why Shi Qinghai happened to hold Yuzi hostage after killing so many people in Parliament Hill. I even heard that some people have started to ask lip-reading experts to analyze what Yuzi said to your friend." Su Li's straight black eyebrows couldn't help but furrow like a twisted blade. He stared at the tea in front of him, which was still as tall as before, and subconsciously shook his head. After a moment, he asked in a deep voice, "Madam, what do you mean now?" "I have already told her everything I know. After knowing the truth of the ancient bell explosion, what is she and the other families going to do?" For many years, Minister Zhou Yingxing had a distinct Thai family background. After Mr. Pabre became the president, as part of the political agreement, he directly became the Federation's Minister of National Defense. At that time, he could even be seen as a strong spokesperson for the government and the military. However, as he gradually showed his courage and ability in the position of Minister of National Defense, he received recognition and praise from the president and many other officers of the Federation. His factionalism had faded a lot. Madam and the others will probably choose to continue watching. After all, the general's reputation has always been excellent, and the damage now hasn't affected the families themselves. As a millennial family that has secretly influenced and even controlled the Federation for countless years, the crazy ideas of the past few years are probably just some kind of repetitive game in their eyes. However, they don't understand that once the armed army starts to rush forward, it will be a dangerous situation that has never been seen before in history. "Do you still remember what I said in the past?" Minister Zhou mocked with a faint smile. "The army is not allowed to have independent thoughts. Once this happens, it will become very scary." The old man said something similar. "As a soldier of the Federation, I have always remembered it." Su Le replied, "I'm glad that you remember. I'm disappointed that more soldiers have forgotten." Minister Zhou slightly frowned. He looked out of the window again and said indifferently, "There's something you may not know yet. Half an hour ago, Commander Yu Qinghai was transferred from the Army General Hospital to the exclusive hospital of the 1st Military Region. His resignation letter and medical diagnosis were divided into two and placed on the table of General Li Jiedu and I as a senior vice division level officer of the new 17th Division, or to be more precise, as the future division commander of the new 17th Division that the federal military had carefully nurtured. Su Le could no longer maintain his calm when he suddenly heard this news. He stood up abruptly, his lips trembling slightly. He wanted to ask something, but in the end, he didn't ask. Commander Yu Qinghai, who was born a chef, looked like a harmless old man, but in reality, he was the last representative of the entire generation of outstanding soldiers under war god Li Pifu. In the war against the Empire, he led the new 17th Division to silently obtain victory after victory, restoring the unparalleled glory of the undefeated division of the past. But now, for some unknown reason, he was forced to leave his combat post. A few days ago, General Li Jiedu made a special trip to the headquarters of the new 17th Division to meet with Commander Yu. As for what they talked about, no one knows. Minister Zhou reminded. Su Le slowly lowered his head, a bitter and self-deprecating smile on his face. As the only son of war god Li Pifu, senior military figures like General Myers and Commander Yu Qinghai of the previous generation, even if they didn't agree with Li Jiedu's way of thinking, when faced with intense conflict, they would always remember whose descendant he was. Then, making the choice to remain silent and give in would not be surprising or shocking. At this moment, Su Le very naturally thought of the time he spent in the hot springs with the old man in Philadelphia, thought of the flashing lights in front of the manor, and even thought of Li Jiedu's gentle smile at the time. The successor of the war god? At the time, the entire Federation seemed to think that he was the chosen successor of the war god, but if Li Jiedu stood out, who would still think so? This was a very ironic and sad truth. Even if it was the Federation's war godly Pifu, once he left this world, there was no way for him to decide who his successor would be. Minister Zhou looked at him and continued, "Commander, you resigned. You were hunted down. It seems that in order to control the troops, some people have lost their rationality and become incomparably crazy." Su Lu raised his head and suddenly asked seriously, "Have you ever imagined that General Li Jiedu could be the leader of the radical faction?"
No.
Minister Zhou was silent for a moment before replying, "I always thought that he was a gentle and respectable military theorist. It was very difficult for me to associate those conspiracies and murders with him. I also never thought of this possibility, but I didn't expect that the most impossible thing would become true," Su Lu replied in a low voice. "Do you want to meet with Li Jiedu?" Minister Zhou asked with his brows slightly furrowed.
No.
"There is no meaning in meeting now." Su Lu shook his head and continued, "As you said just now, he and those people have already lost their rationality and have fallen into some kind of hysterical madness. In my opinion, this kind of madness means that they have already begun to be afraid and have begun to panic." After a moment of consideration, he continued, "I plan to hold a press conference. The time was originally set for tomorrow, but I want to bring it forward to today. Go, be careful. Please be sure to be careful of your own safety. Killing you is because you have the ability to threaten their safety." Minister Zhou replied with a smile, "I don't seem to have this ability, so I am safer than you." Su Lu hesitated for a moment and asked, "They forced you to resign. How are you going to deal with it? Do you want to discuss it with Lady Tai?" The lady and those families can deeply influence the political structure of the Federation, but their influence on the military is extremely limited. After all, the military's true strength is a matter of the Constitution, and it is basically under the guidance of the war god. Minister Zhou said with emotion, "So only the Lees of Philadelphia can influence the military. Of course, the Zhong family of the Westwoods should also have this ability, but unfortunately, those families didn't stop or even tacitly allowed that tragedy to unfold." "But I won't resign," Minister Zhou said calmly. "While some people are busy fighting for or consolidating their power to realize their ambitions or ideals, someone has to remember that on the front lines, in the distant Empire Star region, there are hundreds of thousands of Federation soldiers fighting a bloody battle. They need supplies, ammo, and mechas. They don't care who wins in the Capital Rings vanity contest, and this is my responsibility as the Minister of Defense." He looked at the young Federation officer and said with a smile, "So, I won't resign. I will be like a young man who has fallen in love for the first time, shamelessly cling to the position of Minister of Defense, and strive to do something for the front lines." Su Lu saluted the only federal military general who truly had the demeanor of a scholar behind the table. "Colonel Su Lu." Colonel Su Lu. Under the vigilant protection of the members of Iron Division, Su Lu walked out of the elevator and prepared to pass through the spacious hall on the first floor of the Department of Defense. The officers he met on the way looked at him in surprise and saluted and greeted him with joy or nervousness. They didn't know why he suddenly appeared in the capital's special district when he was supposed to be carrying out a mission in the Westwoods. Almost at the same time, there was a burst of dense and excited salutes and footsteps from the gorgeous revolving door of the Department of Defense building. "Commander Xiaoqing." "Commander Xiaoqing, hello." Surrounded by the officers of the Iron 7th Division, Du Xiaoqing, wearing a straight lieutenant general's uniform, walked in through the door. The officers of the Department of Defense who were busy carrying documents hurriedly stood at attention and saluted in surprise. They didn't know what Du Xiaoqing and the officers of the Iron 7th Division were carrying out, or were they having a meeting? But in short, just as Su Lu was about to leave, he appeared in the Department of Defense building. When he saw Su Lu also noticed his appearance. A faint light seemed to flash in their eyes, but neither of them took the initiative to stop. On the contrary, their footsteps were exceptionally firm and steady, without a trace of slowing down. They didn't stop, and the officers beside them naturally wouldn't stop either. Both of them had a cold and cool demeanor, looking straight ahead, facing each other, but not in each other's eyes. Seeing this sudden scene, thinking of the many rumors in the federal forces over the years, thinking of Du Xiaoqing and Su Li's various military exercises from their graduation day until recently, the originally noisy Department of Defense building suddenly quieted down, and the empty hall seemed even more spacious. Only the crisp sound of military boots on both sides could be heard, getting closer and closer. Right in the center of the Department of Defense building was a huge military emblem of the Federation. It was made of heavy carbon alloy bullet shells laid into the hard ground, and under the light, it shone with a cold light like a sword. When Su Li and Du Xiaoqing walked past the military emblem of the Federation, they stopped at almost the same time. "Commander Xiaoqing." "Colonel Su Li." Su Li saluted, and Du Xiaoqing returned the salute. There was a moment of silence. Su Li stared at the sunglasses on the bridge of his nose and said, "I just heard a sentence, and I want to pass it on to you. The army shouldn't have its own thoughts, because it's too dangerous." Du Xiaoqing's expression was cold, and his hands were behind his back. He stood straight like the last surviving winter pine in the glacier. He slowly took off his sunglasses, looked at Su Li expressionlessly, and replied, "Do you think I need you to tell me the concept proposed in Schiller's political drama?" Su Li looked at his eyes and his hair that was obviously whiter than it was a few months ago, and said, "History will remember many things. I just want to remind you that no matter when, you and your troops must at least remember one thing. The duty of a soldier is to obey orders. According to the charter, they must completely obey the orders of the elected government of the Federation." Hearing this, Du Xiaoqing's cold expression suddenly had a strange change. The corners of his lips curled up, as if he wanted to smile, but in the end, it only turned into a trace of coldness. "Colonel Su Li, you know your position. I don't need you to nag like a woman. I also know what the duty of a soldier is." In the building of the Ministry of National Defense, two groups of officers stood behind the two of them, facing each other. Although it was impossible for them to point their guns at each other, they could clearly feel that the air was filled with the smell of stone after a high-speed collision, as if the stone could be crushed into powder at any time. The current situation was gradually becoming clear. Du Xiaoqing and his Iron 7th Division were one of the strongest supporters of the radical faction in the military. Su Li hoped that he could use words to make the enemy surrender, but at this moment, he really had a lot to say to Du Xiaoqing. "I heard that Shiminjin died?" He looked at Du Xiaoqing and the officers of the Iron 7th Division with a serious expression. Then he slowly narrowed his eyes and smiled. "It's good that he died." Chapter 745. "Colonel Su Li, you have to take back what you just said," an officer of the Iron 7th Division said, "and apologize for it."
No.
Su Li simply refused this suggestion. He still looked into Du Xiaoqing's eyes and said, "You should know very well why Shimin Jin died. In fact, he should have died 5 years ago. What I don't know now is how much you know about what happened 5 years ago, Commander Xiaoqing." In the latter half of the 37th Constitution, no one in the federal military dared to use such a forceful tone to question Du Xiaoqing face to face, not even those big shots. During the graduation day military drill at the training base, although Su Li successfully prevented Du Xiaoqing from flipping out, he still had to play the role of a junior officer in front of Du Xiaoqing. He would never act as tough and equal as he did today in the empty hall. Although Du Xiaoqing was now a lieutenant general and he was only a colonel, there was a strict and insurmountable gap between the two of them. But for some reason, ever since the Westwood Sunset State Army returned after defying orders, it was difficult to find the influence of this difference in class in Su Li's attitude. Du Xiaoqing had been silently, or rather, indifferently looking at Su Li. His right index finger gently slid along the edge of his sunglasses. No one knew what he was thinking. After a moment of silence, Su Li suddenly asked in a low voice, "Commander Xiaoqing, if I remember correctly, you should also be a member of that so-called Trinity Association. I'm very curious. What exactly did you learn in that association? How to shoot your comrades in the back?" In literary works, the word suffocating was often used to describe tense confrontations. When it was used too many times, it often made people feel that it was a little old-fashioned. But today in the empty hall, the Department of Defense officers who saw this confrontation scene vaguely understood the reason for this description. Under the bright lights, the two groups of officers stood facing each other. They looked at each other in silence and did not speak loudly. The invisible collision and friction that gradually heated up seemed to have exhausted the oxygen in the surrounding environment and began to make it difficult for people to breathe. Standing in front of the elevator, standing in the corridor, and standing next to the plants, the officers had long forgotten their work. They nervously stared at the center of the hall. No one spoke. They even collectively, subconsciously lowered the sound of their breathing, waiting for Commander Du Shaoqing to open his mouth to respond. With his usual arrogance and indifference, he would suppress the other party's momentum or intensify the current situation. At this moment, the elevator door opened with an untimely beep. A female civilian officer's documents scattered all over the floor. The officers in the building subconsciously looked over and then cast their eyes back to the place they needed to pay attention to. Du Shaoqing still didn't say anything. Instead, it was Lu Sifu, the deputy commander of the Iron 7th Division, who was standing to his left, who provoked Su Lo in a cold voice. "I heard that Shi Qinghai is dead?" Su Li's pair of knife-like thick eyebrows slightly trembled. "It's good that he died," Lu Sifu added expressionlessly. Su Li's straight eyebrows finally raised. As if venting his anger, he waved his right arm and forcefully chopped down in the air, as if he wanted to break all the difficulties and obstacles in front of him into pieces of scrap metal. His extremely explosive reply resounded throughout the entire building of the Ministry of Defense. "It's a glorious death." These 4 words were like 4 hard stones that smashed onto the smooth floor of the hall. They smashed onto the insignia of the Federation that couldn't be spoken. They were suffused with a metallic luster and filled with a murderous aura. A dull sound echoed in the hall. Du Shaoqing slightly lowered his eyes and looked at the insignia of the Federation at his feet. He seemed to be feeling Su Li's emotions at this moment. In the end, he still didn't say a word. He didn't reveal a trace of emotion. He slowly raised his right hand and put on his sunglasses again. They brushed past each other. There are very few, no, there has never been such a strange situation in this world. Even when my father returned to the capital ring from the Empire all those years ago and was faced with great pressure from Parliament Hill, he never displayed such strong confidence. A convoy of bulletproof military vehicles sped along the quiet roads of the capital suburbs. Behind the trees in the fields beside the roads, the black silhouettes of several MX mechas could be faintly seen. They were silently following and protecting the convoy in a marching posture. There were very few people in the capital ring who could enjoy the privilege of being protected by military mechas. The present chairman of the Joint Staff Conference and commander of the 1st Military Region of the Federation, General Li Jiedu, in a real sense, the #1 person in the military, undoubtedly had this right. However, this wasn't the front lines. This was the capital special district that was countless light years away from the flames of war, a special district that hadn't experienced any turbulence in thousands of years. For him to actually need the protection of MX mechas when he was traveling, it could be seen that this military leader's current mood was indeed, as he had said before. He was filled with some sort of absurd and strange sense of alarm. It is indeed very strange. Deliberately cut off from contact with the 17th Division. Now, he is just a mere colonel without any troops. Yet, it is precisely this kind of person who dares to walk so openly in this city with those 20 or so loyal subordinates of his. Moreover, we have no way of killing him. General Li Jiedu gazed at the flourishing late spring scenery outside the car window and said with a gentle smile, "These young soldiers are like trees that grow freely in the spring. Neither the wildfire nor the spring rain seems to be able to stop their powerful footsteps. On the contrary, it only helps them become even stronger." Of the 17 sniping points arranged, they have successfully evaded 15 of them. 2 of the sniping points have been destroyed. Sitting at the front of the car, the director of the 1st Military Region's Special Operations Room could not understand how those targets had managed to avoid these ambushes. He also could not understand why the general could still maintain such a gentle and calm state of mind in the face of such a strange situation. "I have never hoped that we could use snipers to eliminate the successor, personally chosen by father. These are just some small tricks that are similar to using a tree branch to poke a bull. Through these small tricks, we can clearly see just how far he can go. Then, when we eliminate him, we can make targeted arrangements. Lee Jae-do gazed outside the car window. His expression was calm, and no one could see the danger contained in his words at this moment. Sula should already know that I know where his strength comes from. Then he will think that we will be afraid, will panic, will become crazy, and thus lose without a fight. Those useless bullets will most likely help him think that we have already panicked, that we have already gone crazy. He will relax, and his confidence will become an arrogance that even he himself does not realize. This is very good. Even now, there are still many people who have fantasies about him. They think that they can persuade him, or use as peaceful a method as possible to eliminate him. I am very glad that Sulu is strong enough and confident enough. Then, step by step, he will push himself into an irreversible death zone. General, don't worry, we have arrived at the back of the mountain. The Tai family, whose enormous body was hidden in the shadows of history, was probably the recognized spiritual leader of the 7 major families. The Lees of Philadelphia, on the other hand, suddenly jumped onto the stage of the 37th constitutional era, dazzling and insufferably arrogant. These 2 families, who were supposed to be enemies, had actually always been in close contact with each other. If it was not because the Lees of Philadelphia had just started their inheritance, perhaps this kind of contact could already be called a family friend. Lady Tai of the back of the mountain and the recently deceased military god Li Pifu had always maintained a very close personal friendship because of those historical stories and memories of that traitor. This kind of friendship had lasted for many years. Perhaps it had never displayed its power under the sun, but in reality, it had played a very important role in ensuring the stability and rapid development of the Federation. If the glory of the Lees of Philadelphia began to be passed down, the back of the mountain formally prepared a purely private lunch. However, on the terrace facing the lake, the conversation between Lady Tai and General Lee Jae-do did not seem to go as smoothly as imagined. The half-hanging late spring plants on the edge of the terrace turned their heads rustling, unwilling to waste time to distinguish how many invisible bullets were hidden in the seemingly ordinary conversation between these 2 important figures. Madam, as you said, the political situation of the Federation is indeed in dire need of stability right now, especially after the Parliament Hill incident. The public's mood is very chaotic. Lee Jae-do gently placed the silver spoon on the Guno porcelain plate. After a moment of silence, he gently continued, but the problem right now is that if Colonel Su-lo is allowed to continue investigating that case, not only will Vice President Byron's soul be disturbed after his death, you and those families will also be in a very difficult situation. The political situation will be shaken because of this, and most importantly, the public may lose their confidence in the government because of this. With your wisdom, you should be very clear about the dangers contained within this. Lady Tai held the teacup and silently looked at the lush green hills on the opposite side of the terrace. There was a sense of tranquility and strength in her extremely ordinary appearance. Su-lo has the first order authority of the Bureau of Proclamation, and this authority is helping him in some incomprehensible way. Lee Jae-do continued calmly, the Bureau of Proclamation has not yet found a way to deal with this authority. If you are not willing to help, this matter may really become difficult to control. Generally, actually I am not that much older than you, and now that your father has passed away, there is no need for you to still use honorifics with me. As for the issue of Su Li's authority, the old man should have some idea of it, but since he didn't tell me before his death, I naturally won't do anything. Lady Tai turned her head and looked at Lee Jae-do. She slowly said, "You have kept a low profile for 20 years, but your father's old comrades and old friends like me have never underestimated your shrewdness and ability. I simply do not believe that you will begin your plan before you find a way to control Su-lo." After a moment of silence, Lee Jae-do looked at the woman in front of him and said, "Madam, I know very well that you need to keep Su-lo alive and to keep people like us in the military alive as the successor of the god of war. But the problem is you know very well that Su-lo has never sat on a forklift board. This was a very accurate description of Su Li's personality. Lady Tai's lips curved up in a trace of a smile. Lee Jae-do looked at her and continued, I believe that right now you're very curious as to what he is saying at the press conference that is being held right now. Chapter 746. To hold a press conference at this time, it doesn't matter what he says. The important thing is that he shouldn't have said it in the first place. Lee Jae-do picked up the black curly leaf tea in front of him and took a sip. A moment later, he continued to speak gently. This proves once again that he, who has never sat on a seesaw, can never become the person who can balance the situation like you expect, no matter how good his foundation is, no matter how much my father and you favor him at the same time. He raised his head and looked at Lady Tai, saying calmly, on the contrary, he will make the Federation's situation more dangerous and complicated. Unfortunately, he has this ability.
No.
Lady Tai smiled and replied, according to my observation, that small-eyed boy is now more mature, or rather, more vulgar. For you, for me, and for the Federation, this is an extremely good change. Speaking up to this point, the madam quietly looked into Lee Jae-do's eyes and said with a trace of extremely light, almost to the point where it couldn't be smelled. Otherwise, according to his style of stubbornly resisting my pressure to kill Macklin, even if you have more than 10 mechas by your side now, he would still be foolish enough to carry a few guns and run all over the Federation to kill you. These words were extremely continuous and destructive. Lee Jae-do was slightly stunned, and his face revealed a slightly bitter smile of self-mockery. As the current #1 person in the federal military, he was intimidated by a colonel to the point where he had to carry a mecha whenever he went out. He really didn't have much dignity to speak of. From that year, when Su Le broke into the Oak State Tree Peace Foundation building, I no longer had any substantial influence over him. Therefore, regarding his problem, I think we don't need to discuss it anymore. Lady Tai's right arm lightly rested on the railing at the edge of the balcony. She usually liked to cook simple dishes, so her fingers weren't as smooth as those of other noble ladies. In the spring breeze, she slightly opened her hand, as if she wanted to grab onto something, but also as if she just wanted to feel that comfortable feeling. She gently looked at Lee Jae-do, but there was an unquestionable seriousness. What I want to know now is, after successfully weakening the Zhong family, how exactly do you plan to continue down this path? If it wasn't for Su Lu informing me, perhaps I would still be in the dark. The madam laughed self-deprecatingly, shook her head, and sighed. I just said that we never underestimated your ability, but now it seems that you were able to hide in the shadows under your father's halo for so many years, patiently making such careful preparations. The so-called not underestimating is also a kind of underestimating because for someone as strong as you, no one in the Federation is qualified to judge you. Madam, you flatter me. These people only want to do something for the Federation, Lee Jae-do replied gently. As for the worries of you and those families, there is actually no need to worry. You asked me where we will go. I can't give you a definite answer right now because once the Federation stabilizes, the most important problem to consider is the front lines. Then we can only take one step at a time. But rest assured, we will never touch an untouchable situation. Is this a promise? Lady Tai's eyes narrowed slightly, her gaze suddenly becoming extremely sharp. This question was extremely simple, but it definitely wasn't simple. This meant that the radical forces of the federal military would take a stance towards the 7 families in the Federation's political situation in the future. And this stance would, without a doubt, directly affect the Federation in the years to come. However, when faced with this question that carried countless implications, General Lee Jae-do's answer was actually that calm and concise. Of course, the people left the terrace, and the scenery of late spring was thick. Lady Tai narrowed her eyes slightly, gazing at the lake and mountains in her embrace. Suddenly, she released an almost inaudible sigh, lightly asking in self-mockery, "Do you believe in his promises?" When soldiers become politicians, their promises don't have any meaning. Chun-Li quietly stood behind Lady Tai, playing a role that hadn't changed for several years. Lady Tai's brows slightly furrowed, her voice slightly cold as she said, "I like a more direct answer, not this type of dramatic tone thing." Secretary Shin keenly sensed that Lady Tai's mood was a bit bad, so he obediently nodded in agreement. The situation won't change? Lady Tai expressionlessly shook her head, stood up, and leaned against the railing, leaving no trace on her face. If they didn't want to create a situation that hasn't changed for thousands of years, why would these soldiers be so excited to throw themselves into the dark side of politics that they hated the most in the past? Once the steel monsters have their own consciousness, their appetite will become extremely greedy. Any former overlord is nothing more than a few pieces of delicious synthetic meat in their eyes. Lady Tai turned around to look at Butler Jean, who had appeared out of nowhere, indifferently saying, "Make some preparations. If nothing unexpected happens, this long-term struggle may last for many years."
Yes.
Butler Jean and Secretary Shun bowed at the same time. Lady Tai didn't say anything else. Her simple order was passed down to the huge invisible empire through the hands of these two people in charge of the Tai family, and it would immediately start changing the direction of many things. In order to face the unprecedented challenge that might come, these families that had lived, grown, or rotted together with the Federation for thousands of years had to make some preparations. She lightly touched the railing of the balcony, looking at the picturesque landscape in silence. She really didn't understand where the militants' confidence came from. Just one Qinghai was enough to put them in a terrible situation, and their partners in the government were all purged and killed. Could it be because of the few troops that Li Jiedu controlled? At the end of the day, Payable was an elected president who was highly popular with the people. He had the innate loyalty of the federal army. Most importantly, outside the official residence, there was still that Su Lo who seemed to never die, who would obtain the final victory. What did Su Lo say at the press conference? Lady Tai suddenly remembered this matter for the Federation's press. Su Lo was without a doubt extremely newsworthy. Whether it was the National Girl scandal that caused a lot of commotion years ago, or the countless heroic deeds that later shocked the Federation, they all proved this point. But for the Federation's press, Su Lo was without a doubt the most unpopular person to interview among all the famous people in the Federation. This young colonel, perhaps inherited the style of Philadelphia's army god, had never accepted an interview in the past few years, except for the press conferences that were arranged by the president's official residence and the Ministry of Defense. So when the major media received the news that he was going to hold a press conference, they were all very surprised. Although the time of the press conference was changed again and again, the media had no complaints. With excitement and nervousness, they waited for the Federation's hero, who was qualified to become a news event, to appear. A very small number of reporters who had the most sensitive sense of smell or the most powerful intelligence source vaguely guessed that this press conference might be related to the terrorist attack that shocked the entire universe a dozen days ago on Parliament Hill. The funeral of the Federation's vice president, Mr. Byron, and the two senators had just finished, and the entire Federation was still in mourning. What exactly did Colonel Su Lo want to do? Or rather, what did he want to say? With this sharp question in mind, when Su Lo, wearing sunglasses, walked into the conference room of the George Carlin Cultural and Arts Center under the flashing lights after the press conference began, reporter Wood from the capital's Special District Daily asked without hesitation and without paying attention to Gu Shifeng, who was acting as the host on the podium. He shouted loudly, "Colonel Su Lo, according to my sources, the body of Shi Qinghai, the suspect of the terrorist attack on Parliament Hill, was forcefully taken out of the police station building by you and your team members last night. May I ask if you have any explanation for this accusation? Or should I say, do you want to confirm it? Even if he was a Federation war hero, forcibly taking away the body of a terrorist attack suspect on a day when the people of the Federation were collectively mourning would not be forgiven or understood by anyone." As soon as the press conference began, a reporter asked such a sharp question, which instantly made the venue, which had just quieted down a little, noisy. The whispers were filled with the exclamations of the reporters who did not know what had happened last night. On the podium, Su Lo took off the wide sunglasses on his nose bridge, revealing a pair of small but exceptionally sincere eyes. He glanced at the reporters in front of him and was somewhat surprised to find that the one who asked such a sharp question was actually Wood from the capital's Special District Daily. The camera in the photographer's hand continued to flash, and the high-definition camera had already started working. In the camera, Sulo lowered his head and thought for a very short period of time. Then he held the edge of the table and raised his head. He looked at the reporters and answered very simply, "Yes, I took his body out of the police station building last night. I can confirm this with all of you. Also, I can tell you that he has been buried in a good place." The reporters immediately fell into another wave of restlessness. They really did not expect that Sulo would actually directly admit that he was related to the terrorist attack suspect. These reporters, who were more or less emotionally inclined towards Sulo, looked at the podium with worry and puzzlement. They thought to themselves, "Don't you understand that doing so is tantamount to challenging the psychological bottom line of the people of the Federation?" No matter how worried and puzzled they were, the reporters still had to follow the requirements of their profession and use the fastest speed to compile a concise news article and publish it to their respective newspapers or television stations. Then, a reporter from the Three Linlin Forum Daily seized the opportunity and asked first, "Why? You should know very well that this is already a violation of the Federation's laws." It was a very simple 3 words, but it was the answer that all the reporters, and perhaps all the people of the Federation who were about to be filled with indignation and grief, wanted to know. Why would a hero of the Federation disobey military orders and return from the Westwoods? It was all to bury a terrorist who had committed heinous crimes. Leave the legal issues to the lawyers, and I will answer my own questions. Why did I do this? Sulo narrowed his eyes and spaced out for a while, then answered very seriously, "Because in my heart, the guy who rushed into Parliament Hill is not a terrorist, and definitely not some messy thing like a spy of the Empire. His name is Shi Qinghai, and he is my best friend. He is the guy that the Federation needs to thank the most." Chapter 747. In the southern suburbs of the capital, in the George Carlin Foundation Art Center, on the enormous hologram outside the building was a high-definition rotating shot of the environment. The peach blossoms within reach were in full bloom in the spring breeze. The conference room inside the building was completely silent. The slightly cool breeze from the air exchange system seemed to want to freeze everything in the room. The reporters were either lowering their heads, biting the end of their pens, frowning, or opening their mouths slightly, listening to Suli's calm and simple narration on the stage. This was the story of a spy from Green Dragon Mountain. That spy was called Shi Qinghai. When he was young, his family suffered a calamity because of a certain large enterprise of the Federation. He used his excellent grades to enter the Capital University-affiliated high school and then entered the first military academy to further his studies. After graduation, he was assigned to the 4th section of the Federation Investigation Bureau's Linhai branch. His future was bright. However, no one knew that as early as in school, he had already been absorbed by the intelligence system of Green Dragon Mountain's anti-government army. He became a fish in that famous deep sea that no one had ever seen. For all the people of the Federation, Shi Qinghai is just a very unfamiliar name. He is just an unremarkable stranger. So when the Green Dragon Mountain Committee recognized his identity and produced evidence that he had already been fired, you would very naturally believe that he is a fallen spy with no future. So you can very easily believe the results of the Federation government's investigation. He broke into Parliament Mountain and didn't hesitate to use his life to kill Vice President Byron and the members of Parliament. He is just a deranged, crazy terrorist who is bought over by some power that hasn't found a scapegoat yet. But I know him. He is handsome, confident, and gentle. His grades are so good that he can enter the Trinity Association. His pair of peach blossom eyes can charm all women. Although it sounds like I am looking for a wife for him, it is the truth. As long as he is willing, he can easily obtain wealth and status that ordinary people can't imagine. Mr. Pabre took a military transport plane and landed in Green Dragon Mountain. He completed the Great Reconciliation Agreement that surprised everyone. He was the one who completed the contact arrangements. 4 years ago, Macklin died in the building of the Huanshan Four States Foundation. He and I did it together. I believe that the WikiLeaks video released in the past year is enough for you to digest the shock brought by this news. You can also roughly understand that he once helped the Federation solve its biggest problem. Mr. President pardoned him, without anyone knowing. He served as the liaison officer between the Special Forces and the Department of Defense. In the distant Westwood's occupied planet, he hid in the deep snow alone, wielding the big gun that rang out in front of Parliament Hill. God knows how many Imperial officers he killed. This is the George Carlin Foundation Art Center. 2 years ago, the documentary called Team 7 won all the awards here. My teammates and I were pushed onto the stage by your cheers, and we enjoyed the courtesy of the entire Federation. In fact, Shi Qinghai once fought side by side with us, and he was also qualified to stand under the spotlight, but he chose to walk into the shadows behind the lights again. There was a long silence in the conference room. It was not that the reporters did not have any questions they wanted to ask, but they could clearly tell from Su Li's expression that he had more to say. Su Li rubbed his eyebrows and said, "As I said just now, he is my best friend. So when Mr. President authorized me to investigate the attack on the ancient bell, he, who had no obligation to take the risk to help me, once again walked into the darkness and began to pursue the clues that were about to be forgotten by people." After a short pause, he looked at the reporters who were taking notes and said seriously, "He is used to walking in the darkness, but he is more dazzling than anyone else. A person like this can't be a terrorist. I hope the people of the Federation can understand this. He has a definite reason for everything he does, and only those reasons can make him do so many things that you think are inconceivable." At this point, reporter finally could not suppress his emotions and raised his hand to ask, "Including the attack on Parliament Hill?" "Yes," Su Li replied. The reporters easily deduced a shocking conclusion from these words. Someone asked in a loud voice, "Colonel Su Li, do you think that Vice President Byron and those counselors are related to the attack on the ancient bell by the Imperial fleet?"
"I didn't say that."
"In fact, Shi Qinghai and I have been investigating this matter." Su Li raised his head and looked at the reporter who asked the question in the corner. "That's ridiculous. It's ridiculous." The reporters were shocked and couldn't accept Su Li's words. Although the Federation had investigated the attack on the ancient bell a few months ago and seemed to have found some new suspicious points, it was really hard to imagine that the Vice President of the Federation was involved in this matter. The last investigation had to be terminated for reasons that everyone knows. Su Li looked at the reporters and said, "At that time, Shi Qinghai and I already had some evidence, but unfortunately, we didn't have the chance to continue the investigation. According to the sources of the Department of Defense, you didn't get permission to leave the Westwoods, which is a serious violation of military regulations." Reporter Wood, who had been silent for a while, held an electronic ink pen between his fingers and asked thoughtfully, "What's the purpose of insisting on returning to the capital ring, even at the risk of being punished by military law? Are you trying to clear your friend's name? Or do you want to continue the investigation that was interrupted last time?" "I will ask for a second authorization from Mr. President to restart the investigation on the ancient bell," Su Li replied. "If there are any new findings or evidence, I will inform all of you immediately within the scope of the charter." The reporters frowned and shook their heads subconsciously. They were not satisfied with or did not agree with Su Li's vision of the future situation. "If that's the case, why did you hold this press conference before getting a second authorization from Mr. President? What's your purpose for holding this press conference alone?" Reporter Wood keenly saw the problem and continued to ask, "I want to officially inform some people." Su Li narrowed his eyes and looked at the nearest camera, as if he was looking at the big shots in the Federation's political and military circles behind the camera. After a short pause, he said seriously, "I'm back, and I'm going to restart the investigation. Are you ready?" After the press conference ended, it was almost dusk. The second day of Su Li's return to the capital ring passed quickly and nervously. The shadows of the buildings and the red clouds mixed into a large, colorful mixture, and the originally pink peach blossoms suddenly became bright red. The reporters left the George Carlin Foundation Art Center in 2s and 3s, but no one was in a hurry to return to the newspaper office or the TV station. Instead, they chose to call their acquaintances to the nearby tavern for a few drinks. They heard the extremely explosive news at the press conference, but there was no way to share it with anyone. They had to immediately express the countless questions in their hearts and express the shock in their minds with their colleagues. Without Su Li's clear evidence, no matter how much the media worshipped the freedom of the press, it was impossible to publish the news that the vice president of the Federation was suspected of colluding with the imperial fleet. This had nothing to do with the pressure of the press director in the president's residence. The integrity of the journalists required them to have evidence, and the atmosphere in which the entire Federation was mourning for Vice President Byron was an invisible ruler. Su Li did not leave the art center. The members of Group 7 were scattered around the building, controlling all the dangerous sniping points and guarding his safety outside the window in the red twilight. In the meantime, he was talking to reporter Wood in a low voice in the room. "Why did you ask me to stay alone?" Wood asked in confusion. "Because I trust you. However, I thought that Chief Editor Bob would come with you." Su Li explained with a smile. "It seems that my news popularity is still not enough to attract Chief Editor to come personally." Wood shrugged and said with slight ridicule, "In the past 2 years, you have rejected 3 of my interview requests, and now you say that you trust me. Please don't tell me that this is because we did the last interview with the war god." Su Li shook his head. After a moment of silence, he said, "Do you remember what I just said about Macklin? At that time, in the entire Federation's press circle, only the capital's Special District Daily News dared to question that old man and even investigate him. If that friend of yours, Shi Qinghai, was really involved in the assassination of Macklin, I will prudently express my trust in him. However, this trust is not much because, in my opinion, his cold-blooded performance on Parliament Hill is not what you would call an idealist." Wood lit a cigarette and took 2 puffs. In the pungent smoke that filled the air, he said with a hint of pride, "Speaking of the Macklin case, I led a group of paparazzi to S2 and investigated it for dozens of days. It should be considered the proudest thing in my life." Su Li looked at the red flower that was reflected in the window glass at his feet and suddenly said, "Before you went to investigate, you should have received an electronic document about the investigation of Macklin." Wood frowned slightly. He held the cigarette between his fingers. He did not understand how the other party knew about this. In fact, until today, he still did not know who sent the documents to the newspaper. Those were all found by Shi Qinghai. Su Li smiled at the shocked reporter Wood. He took out a microchip from the pocket of his military jacket and handed it over. "Just now at the press conference, I said that we did not find any evidence. In fact, I was lying. This microchip hides the evidence of Vice President Byron and those few senators involved in the case. I am giving this evidence to you because I trust you and Chief Editor Bob. And I trust you because although Shi Qinghai and I have not fought side by side with you, we have indeed fought together." Wood was silent for a moment. He slowly and carefully put out the cigarette by his feet. After taking 2 deep breaths, he took the microchip with a serious expression and said, "What should we do?" Chapter 748. You and Chief Editor Bob are professionals. You should be able to find the most suitable time to publish these things, but not now. The official residence should be under tremendous pressure right now. What we need to do is to cooperate with Mr. President's pace and rhythm." Su Li said, "The incident on Parliament Hill just happened. The public is very agitated. There are still hundreds of thousands of Federation soldiers on the front lines of the Imperium. The capital ring can't fall into chaos. As far as I know, other than attending Vice President Byron's funeral, Mr. Prabal has not appeared in public for more than 10 days, citing the need to increase the security level." Wood took a puff of his cigarette and reminded him with a slightly hoarse voice, "This situation is not common. If the president really has a plan to deal with this matter, how do you and I know? How can we cooperate? To solve this matter, and to solve it as safely as possible, we must go through the judicial route." Su Li also lit a cigarette and continued, "Mr. President is safe right now. However, some people have quietly built a wall within the government and even within the official residence. We should be able to find a reason to overthrow this wall by gradually applying pressure from the outside." He was about to say something else, but the burning smell and smoke from the front of the number 37 brand cigarettes lingered in front of his eyes. It was a bit of a hindrance. He suddenly realized that it was more like he was talking to himself. There was no need to say too much. Just like before, doing things was always more important than talking. When reporter would left the George Carlin Foundation Art Center, dusk had not yet completely faded. The peach blossoms by the street were smiling in the rich spring breeze and the golden warmth. Sula felt that it was somewhat dazzling. When he was about to put on his sunglasses, he saw a girl that he had never expected to see appear in front of him. Therefore, the wide sunglasses froze in front of his chin in a somewhat comical manner. She was wearing an inconspicuous light gray sports windbreaker, just like the one she wore when she left the spaceport and headed to Céline's concert amidst the cheers of countless soldiers. The hood of the windbreaker covered her head and face completely, covering her beautiful hair that had long turned from purple to black and from short to long. The occasional glimpse of her exquisite eyes under the hood's shadow was still enough to amaze everyone. After the grand funeral and the completion of the statue of Li Pifu, Jian Shuer did not return to the Federal Fleet. Instead, she returned to Philadelphia and spent some peaceful time with the old man in the grave. During this period of time, Su Lu, who was far away in the West Woods, kept a correspondence with her. However, because of so many things that happened one after another, the love that had just become hot on the desolate planet of the Empire unfortunately did not have the chance to burn into an intoxicating flame. I always thought that men and women in love should communicate more passionately with each other. Jian Shuer walked in front of him, gently held his arm, and said with a smile, and should not deliberately keep too far away from each other. The members of Group 7 scattered around the stone steps of the art center, as well as the members responsible for sniping and security missions further away, looked at the slender hand that passed through Su Li's arm through their own eyes or long-range binoculars. They could not help but sigh softly in their hearts at the same time. They could not help but feel envious and jealous. Su Lu smiled bitterly and said, "It's been a bit troublesome recently. Although our relationship has indeed developed a bit too lightly, and we have not even met much." Jian Shuer shrugged cutely, hugged his hand tighter, and said, "But if I were your girlfriend, the more troublesome things are, the more you should tell me. This is indeed my problem." Su Lu said with some shame, "It's probably because I have never been in a serious relationship before, so I didn't consider it thoroughly. I forgive you." Jian Shuer raised her head slightly, her beautiful chin carrying a trace of mockery, her watery eyes reflecting the sunset. Then the two began to walk along the streets of the southern part of the capital. Within a range of 200 meters, on top of a tall building even further away, 20-some members of Group 7 vigilantly guarded the surroundings. The setting sun pulled their shadows very long, very long. The slow and seemingly extremely casual walk did not seem to require any destination. The love between the hero of the Federation and the nation's maiden should have been the most beautiful event in this constitutional calendar. However, in this turbulent era, countless passionate and ugly events happened one after another, leaving no time for people to watch or even catch their breath. There was actually no chance for a beautiful release. Speaking of which, this was actually the first time that Su Lu and Jian Shuer walked like real lovers. It was just that this seemingly peaceful and beautiful love scene had no choice but to wrap around the members of Group 7 and slowly roll around like a snowball. It made people speechless. Moreover, in this extremely rare and precious stroll, the young man and woman's conversation still couldn't help but be extremely unharmonious with the scenery of late spring. In particular, Jian Shuer was extremely clear about the relationship between him and the man from Green Dragon Mountain who had charged into Parliament Mountain. The nation's maiden beside him had already grown up. She still carried a beauty that could topple the entire Federation, adding a bit of gradually maturing brilliance. Su Lu knew better than anyone what kind of clear ideals and perseverance Jian Shuer possessed under her moving appearance. After all, she was the daughter of the #1 traitor of the Federation and the Empress of the Empire. She had inherited the most inconceivable rebellious and daring traits of her parents. However, When he said that Li Jiedu was the behind-the-scenes leader of the radical faction in the military, he still found it somewhat hard to imagine that Jian Shuer didn't show any shock in her eyes. I've always known that this cousin of mine, Li Jiedu, is a very extraordinary person. Over the years, even the most perceptive people in the Federation have only noticed his low profile. They have never thought that behind that low profile is a meticulous thinking and truly powerful self-confidence. Jian Shuer leaned on his shoulder and said softly, "For such an extraordinary person to use such a long time to plan something, then the height he intends to reach must be extremely frightening. If you insist on standing on the opposite side of him, then I only have one piece of advice for you. When facing him, you can't be too cautious. Don't worry too much. These days, I've been working hard to learn how to get rid of the color of impulsiveness." Su Le raised his head to look at the flat red ball in the middle of the street. He frowned, but there was a smile on his face. "On the contrary, I think that cousin of yours should be troubled right now. He needs to be more careful. How many years have we known each other?" Jian Shuer quietly looked at his face and asked. "If we count from the victory concert, then it's the autumn of the 68th year of the constitutional calendar. It's been more than 3 years. Sulis seriously thought about it, then said with a smile, "Of course, if we count from the time you played that little orphan girl on TV, it's been about 10 years, right? You know, I grew up watching the TV shows you acted in. I often hear these kinds of jokes that aren't funny at all." Jian Shuer shrugged and said with a smile, "Actually, what I want to say is that in the past 3 years, you have indeed changed a little. Although you still don't talk too much, you're not as quiet as you used to be." She glanced at the members of Group 7 behind her in the shadows of the street and shook her head with emotion. "And you seem to be a lot more confident. With just these few companions, you dare to claim that the most powerful man in the federal military is afraid of you. In the past, because of your unscrupulous father, I became a fugitive in the Federation. I was as nervous as a frozen fart all day long, so of course I'm more quiet," Sula said. Jian Shuer interrupted, "I know what's going on in the military, but I'm still impressed by your novel and vulgar way of describing things." Sula continued with a smile, "Later, your cousin and the vice president, who died at the hands of Shi Qinghai, wanted to use this incident to pin me down. In the end, my grandfather stepped in and helped me. The biggest hidden danger in my life, the heaviest stone in my heart, suddenly disappeared. Of course, my mood improved a lot. When a person is in a good mood, they're willing to talk more. As for confidence, of course, General Li Jiedu is a very excellent and dangerous person. But as long as I'm not stupid enough to put myself in a dead end, I can't think of any way he can control me." Su Li's thick eyebrows furrowed again. The corners of his lips were tightly pressed together, and he pointed at the few high-rise buildings in front of him and said, "You see, I know very well where the dangers are, so these dangers don't exist for me." "I don't really understand what you're trying to say." In the shadow of the hoodie, that pair of elegant eyebrows furrowed beautifully. She looked at the buildings in the twilight and laughed at herself in confusion. Then she turned her head and looked very seriously at Su Li's face. She studied his straight eyebrows, small eyes, and the faint traces of hardships that added a bit of a man's calmness. "I'm a member of the Lees of Philadelphia. I know better than you that the blood of the Lee family is very stubborn and conservative. My cousin may be the most terrifying schemer, but I don't doubt that in his heart, the glory of the family occupies the most important position." "I've never doubted that," Sula said. "For so many years, for so many things to have done, I believe that a large part of the reason is that he has always been planning how the Lee family can continue to maintain its current status, or rather, its glory after the death of the war god." "Why are you suddenly talking about this?" He looked at Jian Shuer in confusion. "Right now, this dangerous and sensitive situation is one that we have no way of alleviating. It's probably only under certain circumstances that he will give up part of his plan. For example, he won't kill you, but instead try to subdue you. At the very least, it won't be in the next second that the entire Federation will become a battlefield full of blood and fire because of the two of you. So..." Jian Shuer looked at him and smiled. Her eyes narrowed into cute moons. She tilted her head and said, "Let's get married." Hearing these words, Su Li's eyes couldn't help but narrow. Everyone knew that whenever he narrowed his eyes into two slits, it meant that he was in a relatively nervous state. Perhaps he was preparing to kill, or preparing to be killed, or perhaps preparing to get married. The stroll under the setting sun unknowingly came to a stop in front of an ordinary building. This was the marriage registration office of a certain district of the capital. The light screen above the registration office was broadcasting a poorly made picture of flowers. In this spring, a certain person's eyes narrowed like flowers. Chapter 749. In this moment of twilight, Su Lu thought of many scenes from the past. He watched her on TV, he cried in the woods of Heshi State, he went to her concert, and he thought that it was the most beautiful dream that had appeared before his eyes. He suddenly remembered that he did not meet her before the Victory concert, but during that earlier concert filled with slaughter. After that, they became familiar with each other until they went on a blind date. In every similar scene, he would always think of many scenes from the past. It was not that the art appraisal in the library of Heshi State University had really cultivated a strong artistic style, but that those scenes were too deep in his mind. Let's get married. What was very interesting was that in the countless scenes that Su Lu, who was not an artistic youth, suddenly and forcefully wedged into the image of that white-robed, bare-legged, ultra-literary middle-aged man for the peace, love, and justice of the universe. You have to be together. Be together? Master fan of the Empire once said. Squinting at the colorful flowers blooming on the wall of the marriage registration office, Su Lu gently hugged Jian Shu'er, letting the warm embrace melt into the twilight. The barbecue stall on the streets of Wangdu was filled with the smell of chives and bean rolls. The cheap black market stall had 3 extremely out-of-place bottles of expensive Wenjun No. 1. The amber liquor rippled in the glasses, just like the clumsy and confused expression that Su Lu could not suppress at this moment. Xiong Linquan and a few other team members were silently eating dinner at a nearby table. They looked up from time to time, but did not sit over, because Zoe was sitting at this table. And then, Zoe had clearly drunk a lot. Her beautiful face was flushed. She narrowed her eyes at Su Lu and asked, "Did you guys register?" "No, this matter was too sudden." Su Lu answered very seriously. "I promised her that after this matter was settled, we would immediately get married. That hooligan must be very happy that you finally got the most famous woman in the Federation." Zoe looked at her slender fingers and said, "I've never had a problem with your messy love life, as long as you don't marry that disgusting Zhang Xiuming." She raised her head and looked at him with slight ridicule. "What about Shang Qiu and Nan Xiangmei?" Su Lu stared at the wine glass in front of him. Suddenly, he grabbed it and drained it in one gulp. Stimulated by the alcohol, he frowned and muttered to himself, "I'm only one person. The Federation is not like Bermuda, where I can casually marry a few more." Zoe frowned and looked at him. Her nose moved slightly, as if he was a smelly stone in a septic tank. She said sarcastically, "You are not making a choice, but avoiding a choice. Although the effect is the same, you are not fucking manly enough. Take that national girl, for example. She actually asked the girl to take the initiative to propose. Are you a man?" She also drained the wine in her glass in one gulp and mocked, "Now that I think about it, that guy was actually more manly than you." Before he died, he still remembered the women he had messed with. Su Lu wanted to argue about who was more manly, the playboy Shi Qinghai and a useless guy like himself. He just felt that the way Zhou promoted Nan Xiangmei just now was very similar to the way Little Watermelon promoted Shang Qiu in the old mansion in the 2nd Latitude District of Sunset Province. Suddenly, a little boy's sharp cursing voice came from the table next to them. Zoliuhor was probably not used to the smell of the barbecue stall in the night market. He was desperately twisting his body in the arms of the nanny, crying and cursing as he kicked his legs, leaving several footprints on the nanny's clothes. Su Li's face was a little ugly. He looked at Zhou Yu and said, "Why is he so bad-tempered? Stubborn, proud, violent, and cold." Naturally, he inherited it from his evil young mother, Zhou replied self-deprecatingly. I spent too much time on the front line. I really didn't expect you to teach him to be like this. Sula said with a sullen face, You'd better control him, or else I really can't help but beat him up. It's normal for little boys to be naughty. They're still young. They'll be fine when they grow up. When Zhong Huiyan was 5 years old, he already knew how to follow me in the ventilation tunnel without saying a word. Temperament has nothing to do with age. Zhou stared at him coldly and said, This is my son. I'd like to see who dares to beat him up. From a biological and legal point of view, he has 2 fathers. Now that one of them is dead, if I don't discipline him, who will? Sula paused for a moment and said self-deprecatingly, I remember the scene when I bumped into you and your sister in front of the nightclub in Linhai province. I don't want Lu Hua to be beaten into a pig's head by the second Shi Qinghai in the future. I hope he's the second Shi Qinghai. Zhou frowned and slowly lowered her head. Then she raised her head and drank another glass of wine. Sula looked at her quietly. Suddenly, he said to the little boy who was struggling and crying at the table next to them, If you don't listen to me, I'll beat you to death. His voice wasn't loud, and his attitude didn't look very fierce. But strangely, children are probably like animals and were naturally sensitive to real danger. Zhou Liuhua stared blankly at the uncle who was sitting with his mother. He immediately pursed his lips and let his snot drip down. He didn't even dare to make a sound of sobbing. The nanny looked at Sula gratefully. The little boy didn't know whether it was because he was too tired from crying or because he was scared by Sula. He hugged the nanny's neck tightly and fell asleep. The windproof lights on the barbecue stall in the night market gave off a faint glow to the surrounding leaves. It felt warm and somewhat like a scene in a movie. Jian Shuer's idea makes sense. But it's impossible for both sides to stop. I have to send all of them to prison before I can complete the task that the hooligan gave me. Zhou glanced at him and said, I originally thought that with your personality, you would directly rush into the military headquarters in a military mecca and blow up Li Jiedu. I promised the war god, I promised Mr. President, I promised your father, and I also promised Shi Qinghai over the phone. Although he couldn't hear me at the time, I will do my best to protect myself while destroying the enemy. After a moment of silence, Sula said, I still don't have much confidence in the Federation's laws. But after what he did on Parliament Hill, the supporters of the radical faction in the military have been pretty much wiped out. As long as Mr. President can control the situation, the judicial process can continue. Do you really think that someone like Li Jiedu, who hid for more than a decade and used only a few months to easily take over the legacy his father left in the military and firmly control 2.5 military regions and nearly 100 divisions, like Li Jiedu, can really be brought to court by the judicial process? The military is ultimately the Federation's military. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff is not the president of the Federation. This is the capital, not a battlefield. Whether it is from the perspective of the law or public opinion, Li Jiedu has too many inherent shortcomings. If he really dares to instigate a coup in the military, how many of those troops will listen to him and stand against the elected government and Mr. President? Those generals and normal soldiers won't have the courage to face the spirit of the Constitution in order to satisfy his ambition and his seemingly hot-blooded slogans. If it is a war against the empire, the person who is the military is undoubtedly the most powerful. But in the internal struggle of the Federation, that is not completely the case. Just like right now, Li Jiedu really wants me dead, but he can only assassinate me. He can't order the 17th Division to surround this block and directly bombard me and my team members into pieces of meat with cannonballs. How exactly are you going to cooperate with Mr. President's plan? Zhou looked at him quietly. Her watery eyes were tinged with faint worry. If it is really as you said and the president is in a very difficult situation, then the difficult situation can become dangerous at any time. What can you do after the danger knocks on the door of the youth apartment? Bai Yulan said that my greatest strength is that I am good at simplifying complicated things. But right now, the Federation's situation can't be simplified. In your eyes, forcibly returning from the Westwoods and holding this press conference in the afternoon seems more like nonsense to vent my anger. In fact, I have my own plan. Tomorrow, the evidence of Vice President Byron and Lee Jae-doo's involvement in the case of the ancient bell will appear on the internet to create a stir. You know, now the civilian internet of the Federation has been turned into a shit pit by those demons raised by the capitalists. It has no credibility in the hearts of the people, and it may even be directly regarded as a scam or a dark fantasy novel. But it is good to be able to create a stir first. Then, Chief Editor Bob and reporter Wood will choose the right time to release the relevant information. With the credibility of the Capital Special District Daily News, I think this storm will be bigger this time. The Ministry of Justice and the relevant departments, as well as the civilian agencies in the building of the Ministry of National Defense, are still under the control of the official residents. When the Federation begins to stir up a stir, Mr. President will have sufficient reason to either reauthorize me or authorize the Ministry of Justice to continue investigating the case of the ancient bell. I think even Parliament Hill will be on our side at that time. At that time, it will be General Lee Jae-doo's turn to make a difficult decision. Should he wait for the investigation to end or fight to the death? Yes, he will definitely choose the latter, and I will also wait for him to choose the latter. Sulu looked at Zoyu, whose eyebrows were getting tighter and tighter, and explained in a low voice, I am not good at political schemes. I will only force them to take action. I will keep an eye on the slightest change in the troops that Lee Jae-doo can command. As long as they really do take action, I will stop them and get all the evidence in my hands. With this arrangement, the turmoil in the Federation can be controlled, and as long as I stay in the official residence, the most important thing, the safety of Mr. President, can be perfectly guaranteed. Zoyu frowned and held her chin. She suddenly felt that the knowledge she had learned over the years and the judgment and analysis ability that helped Sulu before were all very funny. This is an idiot's logical deduction. At this moment, in her eyes, Sulu really looked like an idiot. She said sarcastically, You said a lot of nonsense, but the most important thing is the word stop. How can you stop the fully armed federal forces? And the safety of Mr. President, how can you guarantee it? Zoe spread her hands and stared at him angrily. Do you think you are the great creator who can turn thousands of armored vehicles and mechas into scrap metal with just a few words? Yes, according to the Charter of the Federation, President Pabre could easily control the army, as long as the army did not have its own thoughts. But now, the key was that the army had the most invincible armed force in the universe and had started to have its own thoughts. Who could stop all this? Sulu raised his wine glass to toast the worried girl in red. He thought to himself that he could indeed turn thousands of armored vehicles, mechas, and even battleships into scrap metal. With the support of the glory of the Charter, a certain someone could do anything, but do I have to tell you this? Chapter 750. Have you thought about Li Feng's problem? Zoyu gently swirled the wine glass with her fingers. The beautiful amber color contrasted nicely with the terrible leek paste. I forgot, Sulu replied. Zoyu looked up at him. After thinking for a moment, she said seriously, You forced your way back to the capital ring and then came up with this so-called plan. In my opinion, it's still laughably naive, but it's only natural when you think about it. You're an engineer who's only good at dealing with machines, numbers, and formulas. It's indeed a bit difficult for you to think about these problems. At least you're willing to think about it, which means you've improved. Perhaps this is a kind of regression. Sulu shrugged. This answer is somewhat interesting. It's much better than the average speech level you've shown in the past. Zoyu mocked. Back to your naive plan. Of course, I firmly admit that if you're really the creator, then no matter how boring your plan is, it'll work. And Mr. President will definitely be happy to see this. So, Sulu, I'll pray for you. Sulu and the members of Group 7 silently disappeared into the night on the streets of Wangdu. No one knew where their destination was, and no one knew what they were going to do. Zoyu sat at the night market stall with a wine glass in her hand. She did not say any useless prayers for a certain person. She just sat there silently, occasionally pouring the wine into her bright red lips. The strong wine almost made her red lips burn. Other than the owner of the barbecue stall, whose expression was much more numb than before, there were no other customers. The nanny carried the child to the car. The two orderlies at the table in the distance looked at her worriedly, worried that she would turn into the rumored unruly and cold young lady when she was drunk. A black car silently slid over like a ghost. There was no logo on the car, not even any eye-catching decorations, but for Zoyu, she could easily recognize this specially made black car. There were no more than 10 of them in the entire universe. Zoyu waved her hand to signal the two orderlies to stay where they were and not to come over. Zoyu took a deep breath and carefully tidied her clothes. She adjusted the angle of the red flower on her temple to be impeccable. Then, she revealed a kind and reserved smile that gave a sense of distance. She stood up and greeted them respectfully. There was no need to worry about the black car at the back of the mountain. Li Ziyuan had officially begun his political career in S2 Oak State. Sula had just quietly left in a black car, so the person in the black car could only be that madam. And that madam was qualified to be welcomed by anyone in the Federation, let alone the girl she had single-handedly cultivated at the afternoon tea party back then. Yuzi, long time no see. Lady Tai looked at Zoyu with a smile, and then sat down. This simple action surprised Zoyu a little. She never thought that madam would sit on a roadside stool covered in grease. This was not a ridiculous reservedness of a rich person who had not experienced the affairs of the world, but a very natural minimum requirement of life. Madam, yes, long time no see. Zoyu calmed her mind and responded with a smile. The curvature of her lips was very beautiful. It was not dazzling, but it was not mediocre. You are calmer than before, and you are more independent than before. This is very good. We women should never put the hope of a happy life on men who have no hope at all. Lady Tai said with a light sigh. What a pity. Back then, I only thought you had a big butt, and now I am discovering more and more of your good points. Unfortunately, it is already too late. Zoyu's face revealed a rare bit of embarrassment. A big butt and good fertility, this type of vulgar and somewhat contemptuous evaluation normally would easily make a woman unhappy, but she was already used to hearing this type of evaluation in her adolescence. Moreover, Lady Tai's tone always carried a natural and refreshing autumn air. I came to see you today mainly for two reasons. Lady Tai looked at her with a smile and said, the first is what Sula said to you just now. The second is, I really want to know from your point of view, who exactly will obtain the final victory in this situation. After a moment of silence, Zoyu said what she could casually say. Then she furrowed her brows slightly and said, although I don't think Sulo is a guy who is good at political structure, I agree with one of his judgments. Even if Li Jiedu's intelligence and ability is astonishing, in the end, he is not his father, Marshal Li. Even if he is in fact the #1 figure in the federal military, he definitely doesn't have the ability to make the entire federal forces go crazy and have the prestige to dance with it. When facing the president and the government, I always feel like he doesn't have too many perfect methods to handle things. If he is slightly careless, he can only leave behind a black name in the annals of history, but there is no way for him to obtain absolute power in this world. That's right. Just like how you're worried about Sulo, this little guy's unreasonable self-confidence. For me, Li Jiedu's overly abnormal and shoddy killing, as well as his completely opposite self-confidence, is something that I am extremely puzzled about. Lady Tai's eyes drooped slightly, as if she was thinking about some very troublesome problem. With my understanding of the Lees of Philadelphia, the old man's son is definitely not stupid to this extent. In fact, the things that have happened recently have already proven his ability. Zoyu sighed softly and said, could it be that blind optimism really is an emotion that can infect each other? But the problem is that history is heavy. He can allow people like Su Le to be naive, but he definitely won't allow Li Jiedu to have the possibility of being childish. History is heavy. This seems to be a topic of discussion during an afternoon tea back then. Lady Tai looked at her and said with a smile. Zoyu smiled reservedly and then suddenly narrowed her eyes and asked, Madam, you are concerned about their victory or defeat. Does that mean that you won't get involved in this chaotic battle? If possible, may I know which side you are inclined to support? Li Jadu, and those people in the army wanted to kill your older brother Crown Prince back then. Naturally, I won't support them. Lady Tai calmly replied, but back then, I could even ignore Macklin, so naturally, I can also ignore these old grudges. After all, I have to admit that regardless of whether it is Li Jadu or those who stand on his side, they have enough qualifications to discuss matters related to benefits and compensation with me. Zoe listened quietly, not saying a word. I won't support anyone, and I won't use benefits as a bargaining chip at this moment. I just need to quietly watch and see who wins in the end, and then ask them to cut a piece for me. This analogy might be a bit vulgar, but you know that I like to cook in the kitchen. Lady Tai said with a smile. Zoe suddenly laughed, slightly raising her proud chin, and said softly, Madam, in my opinion, the so-called quietly watching should be the biggest mistake that the 7 great families have made in these years. Lady Tai's expression froze slightly. When those soldiers tried to kill my older brother Crown Prince in Lin High State Gymnasium, although the elders of the other families personally went to the back of Macho's mountain to explain, and even shed tears to beg for your approval, in fact, everyone knew that they were gloating. They didn't do anything specific, they just watched. When the previous government carried out the Macklin Project, the 7 great families still didn't do anything. You watched as Macklin messed up the Federation, and you only came out to clean up the mess in the end, trying to obtain a decisive victory. However, you didn't expect that Su Lur and Shi Qinghai directly killed that old senator, and the Bureau of Proclamation even found out that Macklin was actually a spy for the Empire. And recently, the radicals of the government and the military joined hands. They even sent information to the Empire's military department to kill Commander Zhong and his wife in Constellation. Then, the government began to vigorously harvest the West Woods. During this time, did the other 6 families do anything? No, you didn't do anything. You were still watching and then trying to follow behind the government to take a few bites. Zhou expression was calm, but there was a hint of her unique biting cold. Even in front of the most terrifying lady in the Federation, her tone was still calm and firm. I don't understand what the legendary 7 great families are thinking. Where did your foresight go? You didn't do anything, you just watched, so now the federal military is basically going to fall into the hands of the radicals, and now you can't do anything. You can only stare with your eyes wide open and refuse to admit it, but desperately hope that Su Lu can solve these problems. Lady Tai listened quietly. After a moment, she smiled slightly and said, Yuzi, I like you more and more, but you have to believe in one thing. For deformed existences like the 7 great families, even if they don't do anything, just watching is enough to deter others. Zhou smiled and shook her head. She said, Madam, I believe that the 72 years of history of the constitutional era will definitely be written by people like Shi Qinghai and Su Lu, who do things. The Charter Square was empty and quiet in the middle of the night. The terrorist attack on Parliament Hill a few days ago had raised the security level of the square by 2 levels. In the dark corners and in the old multi-story buildings on both sides of the square, there were countless police and special task force surveillance teams hidden. For Su Lu, these were not obstacles. The members of Group 7 were divided into 3 teams to hide in the forest behind the Windy Slope Club. Under the cover of the glory of the Charter, he quietly passed through the forest and came to the back of the president's official residence. Just as Zhou said, people like him and Shi Qinghai were the most typical people of action. In the end, the so-called plan still had 2 sides: to be arrested or to arrest others, to be killed or to kill others. He had to enter the president's official residence to implement this plan. Most importantly, he had to ensure the safety of Mr. Pabre under the threat of the radicals in the military. Under the precise coordination of the Federal Central Computer, the 3-level electronic surveillance network of the Federation allowed Su Lu to quietly invade with great comfort. There was no groaning, and no one was alarmed. Then, under the nervous gaze of Miss Federation, Su Lu climbed into the boudoir of the first daughter of the Federation. He looked apologetically at the trampled quilt. The 2 whispered for a moment, and then he came to the president's study. Chapter 751. For the social system of the Federation, 5 years was a complete cycle. This was the political environment decided by the election. As for the dark-skinned president sitting behind the desk, with his outstanding governing ability and wisdom, his increasingly mature and natural political methods, as well as his deeply rooted resume, he had now obtained unprecedented support from the federal citizens. He didn't need to worry about the results of this year's presidential election. The so-called 5 years was just a normal occurrence. The silver frost in his eyes and hair could only prove that President Pobre had put in a lot of effort and care in order for the Federation to go further and obtain the final victory in the war with the Empire. 5 years ago, Tai Ziyuan arranged a scene for Su Lo at the Double Moon Festival Ball in Yue University. Without knowing, Su Lo arranged for the legendary Chao Qiudao from Green Dragon Mountain to meet with Tai Ziyuan. Together with Shi Qinghai, they indirectly facilitated the visit of Pobre, who was still a member of parliament at that time, to Green Dragon Mountain. This set a firm tone for that extremely intense presidential election. In the blink of an eye, 5 years had passed. Looking at the president behind the desk, deep in thought, Su Li's heart was still as calm and filled with joy and satisfaction as before. He was the first president of the Federation who was truly from the poor class. He came from an ordinary family of miners in Donglin. He used to be the most famous public interest lawyer in the Federation. For the sake of justice and victory for the common people, he fought to the end against those terrifying enterprises and families in the Federation. After winning the election, he chose a path that was completely different from the dark political manipulations of the past. He was more direct and passionate, with a clear and calm style. He never made ugly compromises for the sake of the overall situation. He had already proven that he was a real politician, not a politician. Just like what Shi Qinghai said when he raised his glass to celebrate in the bar, Pobre, he is our president. The we here refers to ordinary Federation people like you and me. The headquarters of the 1st Military Region requested to discipline you, but the proposal was suppressed by the Ministry of National Defense. Speaking of which, when are you going to marry Minister Zhou's daughter? Or are you really going to marry that national girl? When President Pobre saw Su Lu standing out from the shadows, he didn't show any surprise on his face. He stood up with a gentle smile, turned off the platform in front of him, and took out 2 cups. Colonel Su Lu, you are a young hero of the Federation. I don't want her messy love life to be imitated by those male students in Linhai who are obviously over-secreting hormones. What do you want to drink? Coffee, tea, or wine? Tea, thank you, Su Lu replied. Although he had already confirmed that Mr. President's safety was not a problem through the old man, when he saw the dark and steady face behind the desk, Su Lu really relaxed. If the military radicals really took crazy measures under pressure and hurt Mr. President, he really didn't know what the Federation would be like tomorrow. President Pobre always seemed very casual when interacting with the staff in his official residence. He looked like an ordinary leader of a work group, without a trace of the president's self-awareness. But in front of Su Lu, this kind of casual expression was very natural and full. It seemed that in the depths of his heart, he had always regarded this outstanding young man as his own nephew. Probably because of the inherent thinking habits of his childhood, Su Lu couldn't really be calm and natural when facing Mr. President. No matter how strong he became, the middle-aged man in front of him from Donglin was after all the president of the Federation, and he was the kind of president that deserved to be respected and followed. Holding a slightly hot cup of ordinary jasmine tea that was brewed by Mr. President himself, Su Lu didn't waste too much time. After confirming that the monitoring equipment in the study was turned off, he used the fastest speed to describe the problems found in the case of the antique bell. President Pobre listened in silence. His thick lips were tightly closed, and his thick straight eyebrows were slightly wrinkled. Whether it was when he heard that the Bureau of Proclamation indirectly provided the charter network to the Imperial Military Headquarters, or when he heard that Colonel Laker secretly destroyed the escape system of the antique bell, there was no expression on his dark face. There were so many people in the Federation government who cooperated with the radicals in the military, and even his partner, the vice president of the Federation, was involved. Perhaps this kind of terrible and sad impact made Mr. President forcibly suppress his anger into intense pain under his calm face. Sulu took out the chip and put it on the table in front of Mr. President. He said in a low voice, "This is the relevant evidence, mainly found by Shi Qinghai. It should be enough to accuse those people." President Pobre didn't take the chip. He casually leaned against the big wooden bookshelf, held the teacup, and said with a heavy expression, "The official residence has received this evidence on the day of the Parliament Hill incident." He put the teacup on the table, and his deep voice was full of undisguised admiration. "Shi Qinghai is a very excellent man. I pardoned him at your request and appointed him as the liaison officer despite everyone's opposition. Now it seems that I made the right choice. He didn't let me down." Sulu just realized that Mr. President had already received the evidence. He was more and more convinced that his judgment was correct. Under the strong pressure of the radicals in the federal military, the official residence really needed the impact from the outside world, or the pressure of public opinion. From the concert in Linhai 5 years ago, to the assassination of Zhong Huiyan, Commander Zhong's daughter, and then to the explosion of the antique bell, the whole thing is very clear. The radicals in the military have been planning for a long time. They are very powerful, but this is not worrying. However, General Li Jiedu actually played such an important role in the radicals, which really makes me feel shocked and uneasy. Sulu looked at the solemn Mr. President and said, "When General Miller retired, Minister Zhou, and even many people, including the Army God, thought that it was the best choice for him to take over the position of chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Because everyone knows that he is famous for being a moderate in the academic faction. I really didn't expect." President Pobre frowned and walked to the window, with a bitter smile on his lips. "I was the one who proposed this motion. There is one more thing that I have been thinking about. When did teacher Du Shaoqing join forces with the radicals? Or was he in this organization from the beginning? I really find it hard to believe that he was involved in the explosion of the antique bell." Sulu followed Mr. President's footsteps and walked to the window. Looking at his thick back, he said with deep confusion, "Everyone in the army knows that he and Commander Zhong are lifelong enemies. He and his Iron 7 Division were even forcibly suppressed by Commander Zhong for more than 10 years. But, according to my understanding on the battlefield over the years, although Shaoqing's temperament is very bastardly and indifferent in some aspects, he really doesn't look like a guy who would shoot in the back. Young man, don't you think what we need to do now is to solve the problem, instead of thinking about the root cause of the problem?" President Pobre stood by the window, looked at him and said with a smile, "I believe you already have your own plan. What do you need me to do?" Sulu shrugged clumsily, trying to look relaxed and natural. He replied, "I am your subordinate, so of course I will cooperate with you. Tomorrow, there will be some news on the civilian network, and then the Capital Special District Daily will publish a related report. I will use this report to ask for an explanation from the 1st Military Region and also ask the court to continue the investigation of Colonel Lake's treason case." President Pobre continued calmly, "As the report goes deeper and the evidence is gradually released, I can ask the Ministry of Justice to officially start an investigation. There is nothing that can stop this. Except for guns and ammunition, nothing can stop the investigation." Sulu said, "And now this is what I am most worried about. In fact, these days some of the staff in the official residence are worried about me like you. And I think these seemingly powerful threats are actually just snow stains in the early spring night. They can't see the sun the next day. No matter how cold the snow is, it can only melt under the sun." President Pobre's voice was low and powerful. "The army is the army of the Federation. Its duty is to obey orders. When any soldier joins the army, they have to swear allegiance to the elected government and the President of the Federation, who is the specific representative of this right, which is me." The most powerful man in the Federation looked calmly into Suli's eyes and said, "I don't believe that the entire federal forces are made up of ambitious people. Even if some officers are blinded by profit, ordinary soldiers will not stand on their side. Without my order, no army can enter within 80 kilometers of the capital's special district. I agree with your point of view. General Lee Jae-do may be able to convince many troops, but he can't convince every specific person, so he can only use other names to carry out hidden operations. Sulu nodded and replied, Mr. President, I promise you, as long as they begin to mobilize troops, I may be able to find a way to slow down the advancement of the mechanized troops. Thinking of that damn federal central computer that stubbornly analyzed the specific situation every time, Sulu silently cursed a few times in his heart. Then he scratched his head and said, even if I can't, I can directly arrest or kill General Lee Jae-do before the situation escalates. Hearing this, President Pobre's eyebrows slightly raised. He looked at him seriously and asked, this is not the time for jokes. Are you sure you can do it? At least a 50% success rate. Sulu silently calculated in his heart, but he didn't say it out loud. With a sincere smile that easily made people feel a sense of trust, he looked at President Pobre and said, please rest assured. President Pobre was silent for a long time. Then he shook his head with a smile and patted him on the shoulder. At that time, Parliament Hill was preparing to hold a special hearing on the matter of you being the student of that traitor. Now that I think about it, it should have been Byron's plan. Byron. I've known him for many years. He was very good at these kinds of political tactics on the surface. I have to admit that he was excellent. In many important moments, I even relied on his maturity and a little cunning to deal with the situation. Now that he's dead, I feel very complicated when I think about it occasionally. President Pobre and Sulu both held teacups and stood side by side in front of the window on the second floor of the official residence. In front of them was the lawn, and further away was the street. At the end of the street was Charter Square. The view was incomparably wide, and there was no danger of being sniped. The president laughed self-deprecatingly. He picked up the teacup and took a sip without knowing the taste. He continued, it was because of that incident that they uncovered your secret, or rather your background. Only then did I know that you were also from Donglin. Actually, I was very happy to know that you were also a rock from Donglin. I was gratified, and even a little happy. President Pobre glanced at him and laughed loudly. Sulu looked at him and replied with a smile, when I found out that you were from Donglin, I believe that many Donglin people felt the same as me when I thought that a Donglin person would become the president of the Federation. We all felt very proud. The Donglin region was extremely remote. Since the crystal mines had dried up, it had become even more desolate. It had gradually become a corner forgotten by the Federation. The citizens of Donglin all looked forward to leaving that planet with no obvious changes in the seasons and no clear view of the beautiful starry sky. However, it was very difficult to enter the capital ring through immigration or examinations. The quota provided by the Federation was extremely limited. However, with Pobre being elected as the president of the Federation and Suli's identity being exposed, there was an extremely subtle change. This pair of Donglin men, who were quite a few years apart in age, had already become the two most famous men in the Federation. The citizens of the capital ring naturally remembered the Donglin region again, as well as the especially famous Donglin rock saying. The Federation government, on the other hand, increased their support and immigration to the Donglin region. My wife returned to Donglin on my behalf at the beginning of the year. President Pobre said, you probably don't know how proud the people back home are of us. Sulu smiled. He suddenly sank into silence. He looked at the starry sky outside the window and said faintly, my hometown can't see such a beautiful starry sky. I can't change this, even if I'm the president of the Federation. It's said that the president of the Federation is the most powerful man in this galaxy, but no one knows that even if the president of the Federation wants to do something sometimes, it's very difficult to make even the slightest change in this galaxy. President Pobre looked at Sulu with an unusually solemn expression. He said, it's really difficult to do things. There were countless agents of the Special Task Force hiding in the corners of the lawn outside the French windows. After the incident on Parliament Hill, the major organizations of the Federation increased their security levels. The security measures in places like the president's official residence were naturally extremely tight. In the rooms downstairs, the The staff of the official residence were busy with their daily work. The rooms at the end of the left and right corridors were a different scene. There were many Special Forces soldiers with cold expressions. They silently lined up together like statues. They were fully armed to the teeth, and the guns in their hands glowed with a cold light. In Su Li's left eye, the armed forces inside and outside the official residence were like countless dense dots of light. Through these soldiers who belonged to the security forces directly under the capital garrison, he could clearly feel the pressure that the president had been under these days. "Mr. President, the people will understand you," he said comfortingly. President Pabre looked at him. After a moment he said, "It's good that you can understand." Su Li sat silently on the sofa in the study on the second floor of the official residence. His hands held the cup of tea that had already become slightly cold. He waited for the president next door to come over with the secret authorization document that was going to be given to him. He was a very patient person. Otherwise, he wouldn't have liked mechanical repair work that was extremely boring in the eyes of ordinary people. However, he didn't know if it was because the taste of the undrunk jasmine tea evaporated too quickly, or because the leather sofa, a cultural relic left behind by the previous dynasty, was too soft. It was only a moment, but it felt like an eternity to him. He continued to sit. He sat alone. He sat more and more alone, and it was getting colder and colder. Su Li narrowed his eyes. He looked at the dots of light that were scattered in various areas of the official residence in his left eye. He looked at the changes in the situation in the buildings around Charter Square further away. He suddenly remembered something that the president had just said. "Without my order, no troops can enter within an 80-kilometer radius of the capital's special district." The troops that suddenly appeared in the streets and alleys were definitely less than 80 kilometers away from the president's official residence. The closest one was not even 800 meters away. He raised his head and silently looked at the heavy wooden door between the study and the confidential room next door. He confirmed that the president was on the other side of the door and didn't leave. He frowned and licked his dry lips. Through the communication system next to his collar, he sent the latest order to the members of Group 7 who were waiting outside the official residence. "All of you," after pausing for 2 seconds, his brows furrowed tighter and tighter. He continued in a soft voice, "Retreat immediately. If you encounter an abnormal situation, don't resist. I repeat, don't resist, and then this is an order." After finishing what he had to do immediately, Su Li stood up and put the cup of jasmine tea back on the desk. He quickly walked to the window and narrowed his eyes to observe the situation in the lawn and the dark night. Then, with a whoosh, he forcefully closed all the thick curtains. The starry sky outside the window was covered, but the light in the study was brighter. The truth and falsehood of the light didn't affect the lighting effect. He quickly walked to the door of the study near the corridor. He narrowed his eyes and saw the scene behind the door. He couldn't help but smile self-deprecatingly. He turned around and pulled off the belt on the bookcase. He forcefully locked the door and then subconsciously shook his head. After doing all this, Su Li sat back on the uncomfortable leather sofa again. He rested his elbows on his thighs and thoughtfully stared at the wooden door that didn't open for a long time. It really didn't take long, but it felt very long, he said to himself in his heart. Feeling was really a terrible thing, because feelings were the best at deceiving people. Su Li shook his head and took out a 37 brand cigarette from his jacket pocket. He tiredly leaned against the back of the sofa. The fingers of his right hand holding the lighter were slightly trembling, just like the extremely complicated feelings at this moment. Chapter 752. It was already late at night. The bustling Charter Square and the bustling Parliament Hill had become incomparably quiet. Only the group of 5 in the middle of the square were still sizing up their new comrade, puzzled as to why the god of war looked so old. Occasionally, a gust of wind would blow past, causing the green leaves on the ground to roll slowly. Because it was late spring, there was no feeling of desolation, but there was no joy or warmth either. The The sudden sound of emergency brakes came from under the specially made bulletproof tires of dozens of dark green military vehicles, piercing through the silent night sky. Then, the rumbling sound of armored vehicles blended into the sound, waking the rich people around the square from their dreams. Some people walked to the window in confusion and looked at the armored vehicles and military vehicles that were quickly dispersing around the square. They watched as the densely packed, fully armed soldiers quickly rushed into many important buildings, including the Ministry of Finance. They couldn't help but be shocked. This was the capital's special district, and shocking scenes rarely happened. What was going on? What did this troop of unknown origin want to do? In a short period of time, a large screen appeared above a military vehicle in the middle of the troop. The words "drill" were silently displayed on the screen. At the same time, many soldiers began to enter the building to explain to the panicked people. It turned out that this was a special military drill in response to the attack on Parliament Hill. Of course, this was not a military drill. When the members of Group 7 scattered around the presidential residence received Su Li's order through the communication system, they knew that there was going to be a big problem today. Gu Shifeng frowned and combed her sweat-soaked hair with her chubby fingers. She didn't know how to respond to the leader's order. After receiving the order, the communication system automatically shut down. They didn't know if Su Li was still in the presidential residence, nor did they know what had happened to him. What should we do? Xiong Linshuan's buzzing voice sounded from the system. It was an exceptionally violent and impatient voice. Should we storm into the residence and take a look? Don't you think it's a little too difficult for us to storm the president's residence with just 20 people? Gu Shifeng mocked, then frowned and said, "Let's retreat." This is the leader's order. Retreat again? Withdraw my ass. The angry voices of the members of Team 7 could be heard from the communication system. Someone said in a low voice, "Every time we are about to fight, the boss always wants us to retreat and take over the work himself. That time in 3320, that time in the Empire. What the fuck, are we really useless shit-stirrers?" Gu Shifeng understood the feelings of her team members. Everyone knew that Su Li would abandon his team members to play the role of a lone hero because he was worried that something would happen to his team members. However, no one could accept that they couldn't help Su Li. Boss doesn't like to play with us. What can we do? He was hiding in the bathroom on the second-last floor of the Ministry of Finance building. He was in charge of communication with the entire team. After a slight pause, he returned to his role as the temporary commander and said in a deep voice, "Everyone, quickly retreat. I repeat, quickly retreat from your current positions. Remember, this is an order." A soldier's duty was to obey orders, so the federal forces had to listen to Mr. President's orders. However, for Team 7, Su Li and Bai Yulan's orders were irresistible. Therefore, no matter how angry, worried, and unwilling they were, the team members still used the fastest speed to pack up their equipment and prepare to retreat from their positions. At this time, Gu Shifeng, who was destroying the 24-hour electronic data, heard the screeching sound of brakes coming from the ground. Through the window of the bathroom, he saw the endless stream of troops coming from the streets. His eyes narrowed, and he finally understood why Su Li ordered them to retreat first. Of course, this was not a drill. This was a standard military operation. In the face of more than 2,000 elite soldiers of the Federation, as well as those heavy firepower armored vehicles that were ready to attack in the night, no matter how strong Group 7 was, they were just a small wooden boat in front of a huge wave. How could they resist? Gu Shifeng stared at the Federation soldiers charging toward the Ministry of Finance building. Suddenly, he pointed at the metal button on his left sleeve and said in a deep voice, "I repeat boss's order again. No resistance. No resistance." This was a secret military operation with an extremely high level of confidentiality. This military operation mobilized the 3rd Military Region's Iron 7th Division, the Capital Garrison Division's 2nd Division, and the 1st Regiment's elite and loyal troops. Before the operation began, only the highest military officers of these 3 troops knew the specific details of tonight's operation. This secret military operation relied entirely on verbal orders. There were no radio calls or electronic files. The troops didn't even activate the military command system, nor did they use the mechas. Even the remote control systems and chips in the armored vehicles and military vehicles were completely dismantled. There were no orders in the air, no electrical noises unique to the command system. There were only standard field hand gestures and manual light screen adjustments. More than 1,000 Federation troops, like a black mass of silent ghosts, quickly took control of all the passages around the president's official residence. Sporadic gunshots came from the southwest corner, and then it quickly returned to silence. A staff officer in the army suppressed his strong puzzlement and doubts about the military operation and quickly ran to a military vehicle on the street. He lowered his body and said, "We have captured 8 illegal armed soldiers, which is 14 less than the plan. We're still searching for them. I don't know why, but none of the captured soldiers resisted. Also, the Capitol Police Bureau has sent officers over. The Ministry of National Defense is asking us what we are doing." The car window slowly rolled down, revealing Du Xiaoqing's expressionless and extremely cold face. He looked at the Charter Square in the night and didn't care about the questions from the Capitol Police Bureau and the Ministry of National Defense. He gently pinched the leg of his sunglasses and asked, "What was that gunshot just now?" A member of the 7th Group tried to escape by jumping over the wall and was shot in the leg by the sniper of the 1st Group of guards. "Is he okay?" "It's not a big problem."
Not bad.
Du Xiaoqing pushed open the door and walked out. He said, "I still insist that those guys can't be considered real soldiers. But during the war with the Empire, those guys have proven their combat strength. The troops need them alive. Since they didn't resist, pay attention to their personal safety." "Yes, sir." The staff officer looked at the commander who was walking in the direction of the president's official residence and shook his head in confusion. After finishing the cigarette, Su Lu lit another one. Watching the flame gradually spread over the 3 words, Su Li's eyes narrowed. He took it in front of him and carefully examined it, as if he was trying to find a secret that he couldn't understand no matter how much he thought about it. Time ticked by, but no one pushed open the door of the study, which was next to the corridor. Only the sound of heavy footsteps could be heard faintly. Sitting on the sofa, he stared at the burning 37 brand cigarette, shook his head, and cursed a few vulgarities about Didi. Without the old man's help, Su Lu could accurately judge that the soldiers outside the door must be fully armed. They wore hard bulletproof vests, heavy transparent bulletproof helmets, and held dangerous high-firepower guns in their hands. The door between the study and the confidential room was also not opened. The most powerful man in the Federation was behind the door. Su Lu licked his dry lips, stuffed the cigarette butt into his mouth, and took a deep breath. He knew that he could not rush through the door. As for the door behind him, outside the window to his left, the lawn around the official residence was already occupied by hundreds of the Federation's most elite Special Forces soldiers. If he really dared to rush, then what greeted him would be countless bullets. Previously, he had thought that the elite special forces in the official residence, which belonged to the security forces directly under the capital garrison, were special measures used by Mr. President to protect him. Only now did he know that they were special measures used to arrest or kill him. This was really ridiculous and hilarious. But Su Lu could not laugh. He felt as if he had returned to the abandoned mine pits in Dongwen. Looking at the huge rock in front of him that was piled up by the mining machine to the wastewater outlet, his mood was irritable and gloomy. Because of this mood, he just stared blankly at the Federal Central Computer that constantly displayed the firepower layout around the official residence in his left eye. He looked at the precise electronic map that showed the troops that had already controlled all the streets and alleys, but he did not have any conversation with it. "One's here." He carefully put out the cigarette butt and counted the number of people he would see. Then, using the chip positioning provided by the Federal Central Computer, he confirmed that the second one had also arrived. So, he silently said in his heart, "Open the door between the study and the confidential room opened." To be precise, it should be that the door, together with the large bookshelf full of books and the wall behind it, quietly opened and disappeared into the thick wall. A transparent glass wall appeared between the two rooms. Su Lu narrowed his eyes and looked over there. He knew that this could not be a real glass wall, but a high-strength composite security wall. He had read the information beforehand and knew that the security measures inside the official residence were very strong. At that time, he was relieved for Mr. President's safety, but now he trapped himself. This transparent wall was thicker, more indestructible, and more infuriating than the wall that blocked in front of him in the Four States Foundation building. It separated him and the people behind the wall into two different worlds. At this time, anger and disappointment were a wall. He was on one side and President Pabre was on the other side. On the second day after the funeral of God of War Li Pifu, Li Jiedu stood up straight and participated in a secret meeting of the Trinity Association. In that meeting, facing the members' proposal to let Zhou Yingxing resign from the position of Minister of Defense, the Vice President of the Federation, Byron, once showed strong confidence and demanded that all actions should be based on the fundamental interests of the Federation. At that time, he smiled and said, "We are the Federation." In the luxurious washroom of the Parliament building, which was full of the aura of death and torture, Shi Qinghai once asked Shi Minjin, if that Mr. Senator was not Byron, then who was it? Shi Minjin, who was bleeding nonstop, looked at him and laughed nervously. She asked him mockingly, "Do you and Su Le know who your enemy is?
Do you know who we are?"
On the shining emblem of the Federation on the building of the Ministry of Defense, Su Lu once seriously and solemnly reminded Du Shaoqing that as a soldier of the Federation, his duty was to obey orders. Du Shaoqing's expression was very complicated and strange at that time. He said that he knew. Yes, he did know, and he had always done so. The answer was revealed. It was not pleasant, and it was somewhat sad for a long time. There was silence in the president's residence. No one spoke. Only the suffocating, heavy breathing of the soldiers could be faintly heard through the walls. President Pabre looked at Su Lu through the glass wall and was silent for a long time. He slowly held his forehead with his broad palm, as if the decision he was about to make was extremely difficult for him. Li Jiedu stood behind him with a gentle and calm expression as usual. Du Shaoqing stood at the door farther away. It was unknown when he had put on his sunglasses again, but there was no trace of expression on his face. President Pabre's tanned face was slightly firm. He said slowly, "At the press conference in the afternoon, you said to the camera that you were back. You asked if we were ready. I was very worried about you." He shook his head and said with emotion, "I was worried that you were not mentally prepared enough to face all of this." Sula looked at Pabre's face very seriously. He felt very strange. Why was it that at this time, there was still no way to see any sense of insincerity on his face? So he remained silent, wanting to hear what the other party wanted to say. "For so many years, you are the young man I admire the most." President Pabre's voice passed through the transparent wall. It was still so deep and powerful, and seemed particularly sincere and firm. He looked at Su Lu with unwavering eyes and said in a deep voice, "At this time, there is no need for any deception between us. You can believe this without hesitation. No matter what kind of suffering and pain you have experienced, you still have innocence and hot-bloodedness in the depths of your bones. And this kind of naked, beautiful trust is very rare." Su Lu suddenly opened his mouth without warning. He frowned and looked at the people on the other side of the transparent wall. It was unknown whether he was asking them or asking himself. Naive is the synonym for stupid? I just told a friend this afternoon that as long as I don't force myself into a dead end, no one can catch or kill me now. Then I realized that because I was afraid of you dying, I really foolishly forced myself into a dead end. There was no obvious expression on Su Li's face. His fingers gently rubbed the extinguished butt of his cigarette. He shook his head and said, "I don't understand. How did I suddenly become a stupid cunt? And the reason for becoming a stupid cunt is actually so fucked up. Just like those deliberately mystifying novels of Schiller's in the late period. Why is it that the most righteous old man would finally tear off his mask and proudly tell the whole world that he is the worst one? His straight black eyebrows were furrowed so tightly that they were forcibly twisted into two question marks. He looked at the still dark and steady face of the president behind the wall and shook his head. This is not right. This is not pretty. You have to at least let people feel that this world is still a little bit bright, right? The president of the Federation, the vice president, the senior senator, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the invincible general of a generation. Yes, you are the Federation, you are the army. Su Li's face was full of self-mockery. Then he suddenly stood up and raised his voice, roaring angrily toward the other side of the wall. But what kind of shitty Federation and army is this? Chapter 753. For Su Lo, his world had reached its most dangerous moment. This kind of danger had nothing to do with life and death. It was only related to the collapse of something. Therefore, he was forced to let out an angry roar, but this roar was definitely not his final groan. After returning from Sunset Province in the West Woods, he went to the Charter Square to look at the candlelight. He went to the hospital to look for a nurse to fulfill Mr. Sher's last wish. He went to the tomb to be silent. He and Zoe ate barbecue on the street. They were silent and relaxed. Unexpectedly, he did not go crazy. The reason for this was that he was very confident in this world. When the glory of the Charter was on his shoulders, when the president of the Federation was in his official residence, no matter how evil and dark the forces were, they were actually just a bunch of clowns to Su Lo. In the end, he realized how pathetic he was. He realized that he had been deceiving himself and others. He was actually the saddest clown. If this world could be simply divided into good and bad, he would never have thought that President Pabre was a bad person. The reason why he had such a firm belief was probably because he had never thought or did not dare to think or did not want to think at all. He, Shi Qinghai, and many others sincerely wanted to protect this world. It turned out that justice and light would not always prevail in this world. This was also a case of if. If what they were protecting was justice and light. This was the best era. The Federation finally had its first civilian president. The government and Green Dragon Mountain finally achieved a great reconciliation. Tens of billions of people were motivated and united. The frontline troops were winning one victory after another. But this was also the worst era. The most cold-blooded, ruthless, and dirty political murder. The most ambitious and ruthless plan. The military generals who had guarded the western border for the Federation for many years were ruthlessly sold out to the Empire's fleet. And the people who planned all this were the most important people in the Federation's government and army. It was actually the president who was infinitely loved by the people. Su Lo silently looked at the solemn face of the president behind the transparent wall. He thought of many things in a very short time. He vaguely realized that the president did not kill him immediately. Instead, he took the risk to stay and have a face-to-face talk with him. What kind of talk would they have later? What should he insist on? I should probably persevere. Would he say, is what you think justice is justice? These questions could be analyzed in detail. There was no conclusion to the debate. But just like last year in the Empire's White Courtyard, I conducted a psychological analysis of the princess. I am not a moralist. I am a selfish youth who seeks the meaning of life and happiness. What I have defended and will defend is not morality and justice, but what I think is right. Since that is the case, I will naturally persevere and stubbornly continue to be selfish. Only in this way can I be happy. Su Li's thoughts, which were moving at a high speed like the chaotic particles erupting from the crystal engine of a space battleship, flashed through his mind in an extremely stimulating manner, causing him to feel waves of pain between his eyebrows. Then, miraculously, he quickly calmed down, and there was not a trace of anger on his somewhat wooden face. Mr. President, just now, the two of us were looking at the starry sky above our heads by the window and talking about the hometown of Donglin. Su Lo gently stroked the bracelet on his left wrist with his right hand behind his back. He recalled the words signed by Kant on the surface of the bracelet. He looked down at the suede carpet in front of his feet and asked, "You trust me so much and you trust you so much?" You are not afraid that I will find out something and kill you directly on the spot? President Pobre laughed. His thick lips appeared particularly sincere under the light. Although you have killed many people, I have never thought that you are a person who likes to kill indiscriminately. Sula, no matter what, my trust in you has never decreased. So there are 300 fully armed soldiers outside waiting to shoot me into mincemeat. Sula laughed self-deprecatingly. He pointed his finger behind the door and looked out the window. Even the field army has been pulled into Charter Square. Mr. President, I am flattered by your trust in me. The fact that you can calm down so quickly at this moment really surprises me. President Pobre frowned slightly and looked at him with a smile on his lips. Sula was silent for a moment. In such a tense and dangerous moment, he sat back down on the leather cultural relic sofa and replied softly, "All the anger of humans comes from their incompetence." If that is the case, why should I be angry? All the anger of humans comes from their incompetence. This sentence is very interesting. President Pobre nodded. He calmly looked at Suli's face and said, "It seems that you still think that you have enough ability to face all this. Well, I will not comment on this, but since you are calm enough, I think you must want to know the story of us people." Sula did not answer. "Even if you don't want to know the story, I still have to say it because I really want to convince you through this story." President Pobre smiled slightly. He slowly stroked his broad palms on the table and looked at the spring night outside the window thoughtfully. At this moment, a spring rain fell without warning. It hit the window on the second floor of the president's residence and made a soft pitter-patter sound. Then, it was slowly pulled into traces by gravity, and the moisture seeped in through the window. The beautiful rain seemed to know that it was not a good time. It quietly sneaked into the clouds and came to the ground. It kindly moistened the dry and cold air in the room between the men who were hugging each other. In the soft sound of the rain, President Pobre was silent for a moment. He pursed his thick lips and said in a loud voice that was slightly tired and hoarse, "How a person should live their life is a question that everyone has to think about. When I was young and looked at the dark sky above my head on the slag heap of Donglin, the dream I could hold was to get rid of this planet that made it hard to breathe, go to the capital ring to study and work, and then get the immigration quota." Sula listened in silence. His right hand tightly grasped the right pillow of the sofa. He remembered that his dream was to become a warship mechanic or to work in the capital ring's motor company. As time passed, his original dream now seemed so quiet and humble. The story told by the president was very simple. At the beginning, it answered the biggest question in Suli's heart. If the terrorist radical organization that had been secretly planned for decades and finally gradually controlled the government, and the army was the evil design of the geniuses from the Trinity Association, then President Pobre came from the Donglin region. His life experience seemed to have no connection with the Capital University-affiliated high school and the first military academy of the Federation. Why was he involved in such a huge plan? Why were so many geniuses in the Trinity Association willing to shed blood for him, take the blame for him, and block bullets and rumors for him to become the real #1 person in the Federation? That tavern was called Santa Fe. I heard that it was a religious brand from Bermuda. At that time, I only had about 200 Federation coins, but when I passed by that tavern, I still couldn't help but go in and have a drink. Lee Jae-do stood aside with a smile and slowly added, "Santa Fe is most famous for the religious blood wine that was smuggled from Bermuda." Yes, that was what I drank at that time. When President Pobre talked about this past, he couldn't help but laugh loudly. He waved his broad palm in front of him and said, "In the end, I drank too much and spent all of my 200 Federation coins. That was half a month's rent for you and your sister-in-law," Lee Jae-do said. At that time, because of the pollution case of Shika Pharmaceutical Company, I was fired from the law firm for the first time. My wife and I carried boxes and wandered everywhere. It was rare for me to borrow half a month's rent. I shouldn't have gone to the tavern to get drunk, but I always thought that I continued to do the right thing. Speaking of this, President Pobre's thick eyebrows furrowed. This unpleasant memory had now become a kind of spiritual wealth, but he still didn't forget the impulse and the unique grief and anger of a young man when he stepped into that tavern. He turned his head and stared into Su Li's eyes silently. He said, "Since I did the right thing, why was I only able to live in a small dark room for 400 Federation coins a month?" The inflation in those 2 years was very high. The conditions of a small dark room for 400 Federation coins were indeed very poor. Li Jiedu shook his head and added with a smile, while Du Xiaoxing, who was standing at the door, still had an indifferent expression on his face and didn't take off his sunglasses. President Pabre looked into Su Li's eyes and said calmly, "Santa Fe is outside the west gate of Capital University, and the first military academy is just 1 street away." A poor lawyer in dire straits didn't dare to go home because he drank all the rent that his wife needed the most, so he could only stay in the tavern and look for opportunities to pick up money on the ground. Of course, this is a joke. Li Jiedu smiled warmly and said to the president, "You're a bit emotional today. Let me explain." He looked at Su Lu and said calmly, "At the time, the Trinity Association was having a meeting in the tavern. Byron, I, and a few of the current middle-aged people, and even the old people, as well as the young people back then, were caught in a fierce argument about the political, economic, and history of the Federation. You know, those who are qualified to enter the Trinity Association have enough right to be proud. They all have their own views about the world, and no one can convince the other. But we basically came to a consensus. If the Federation is to continue to develop, the 7 great families, these abnormal existences, must be eliminated." Li Jiedu's eyes drooped slightly, and he said softly with a smile, "This is the wild imagination of the young people, but you have to allow the young people the right to be wild. But how to do it?" We began to quarrel fiercely again. The quarrels of so-called geniuses sometimes often fall into a state of fantasy. At the time, we didn't have the courage to pick up guns and go to war with those families and politicians. We just liked to quarrel, and through quarreling, we found some kind of courageous pleasure. At this time, in the corner of the Santa Fe Tavern, a drunkard suddenly stood up. His skin was dark, and he reeked of alcohol. I don't know when he heard our discussion, but he directly pushed open the door to the private room and looked at us, this group of proud people, and started cursing. It only took him half an hour to convince all the proud members of the association, including me. If we want the Federation to go in the right direction and want to eliminate the 7 great families, then we must seize politics and the power above politics at all costs. That is, the power of violence. After that, everything started in a small tavern called the Santa Fe Tavern. In this tavern, a group of geniuses of the Trinity Association were directly convinced by a drunk black man to carry out some great or crazy plan. President Pabre slightly frowned and recalled with emotion, "In the tavern, I didn't pick up that month's rent, but picked up a group of abnormal geniuses whose average IQ was much higher than mine." Li Jiedu raised his head, looked at Su Lu, and said with a smile, "You see, this is how history changes." Chapter 754. Joining the Trinity Association required extremely harsh conditions. Just by thinking about the amazing Shi Qinghai, one could probably agree with what President Pabre had said earlier. The people who drank lightly in the tavern definitely had a superhuman IQ and extraordinary abilities. In short, they were indeed a group of abnormal geniuses. An unemployed, tan lawyer who had just been fired from a law firm and wandered the streets in the snowy winter of the capital, drinking until he was dead drunk, actually used less than half an hour to successfully convince this group of abnormal geniuses and make them really start to carry out this seemingly crazy long-term plan. This was a historical event that not many people knew about for the time being, but it would probably be firmly recorded in history books. It seemed so incredible. This is probably the charisma that Shi Qinghai once talked about, Su Lu thought silently. His right hand tightly gripped the armrest of the leather relic sofa. His fingers felt the cool and smooth touch, and his mood was extremely complicated. Silently looking at the dark-skinned, middle-aged man behind the transparent wall, Su Li's thick eyebrows furrowed tightly. Why was the gaze in this man's eyes always so calm and deep, giving people a feeling of trust? Why did his straight eyebrows look so calm? Why was his expression so normal, but people could always see the compassion hidden inside? Was it because he deeply loved the Federation and this starry sky? What a valiant actor! Well, no matter how much people ridiculed him in their hearts, this middle-aged man really had a special quality that could persuade and move people around him. He could influence people around him to stand by his side and bravely and arrogantly move forward towards an uncertain goal. For example, the members of the Trinity Association who were having a meeting in the tavern back then, or the cold and proud Du Xiaoqing, or the former Su Lo and Shi Qinghai. There wasn't much in common between the members of the association and Mr. President, except that we were all once in the military. It was just that the military branches and services we served were different. After that, our lives didn't seem to have much in common or connected. General Li Jiedu continued slowly. After that, we met a few more times in the tavern in Santa Fe. However, we all had our own careers and studies, so we separated very quickly. After that day, Mr. Pabre and I sponsored Mr. Pabre to return to the legal world. After strictly abandoning the so-called mental misophobia of the so-called liberals, Mr. Pabre successfully entered the Industrial Workers Association, and then he became the appointed lawyer of the 3 major unions and the Veterans Association. Byron is a little older. He was the first one of us to run for office and step into the political arena. I still stayed in the army, but according to the plan, I left the frontline field forces and returned to No. 1 hospital to teach and educate people again. In the past 10 years of teaching, I have discovered some very good young talents. I can proudly say that these young people are the key to the true success of our great cause in the future. Su Lu looked at Du Xiaoqing, who had been standing by the door. Du Xiaoqing remained silent. The sunglasses on the bridge of his nose reflected the light in the confidential room, clear and inexplicable. No, Du Xiaoqing entered the association and was able to accept our ideals. It had nothing to do with me. Li Jiedu said. Mr. Pabre personally convinced him. Su Lu knew what he should be feeling at this moment. The entire federal forces knew that Mr. President had never concealed his special appreciation and care for 2 people. Whether it was promotion or related complaints, everything went smoothly under Mr. President's personal care. These 2 people were Su Lu himself and teacher Du Xiaoqing. However, he had never thought about what kind of story was hidden behind this appreciation. This is a very simple story. I want to explain to you that our ideas may be a bit crazy, but we are pragmatists. We are doing these things step by step. President Pabre looked at him calmly and said, "Doing what? Continuous murder? Including those waitresses lying in pools of blood in the Linhai State Gymnasium, including the little girl from the Zhong family who wasn't even 10 years old at the time?" Su Lu stared at the people behind the wall. There was not a trace of emotion on his face. "Don't forget, I was there at the time. I know what you did. I saw with my own eyes those ordinary people who didn't even know what happened to them die painfully. Mr. President, there is something that even now I still don't understand." He spoke particularly slowly and heavily. His brows were furrowed painfully. "At the time of the presidential election, Mo Cho was your partner and supporter behind the scenes. Why did you go and kill Tai Ziyuan? Why did you let so many people die?" Then he looked at the silent Du Xiaoqing and asked, "You said you were a soldier of the Federation, so you had to follow orders. I won't ask you what happened after that. However, when the Linhai State Gymnasium incident broke out, he wasn't the president of the Federation yet. He was only a member of parliament. Why was Shimin Jin involved? Teacher Du Xiaoqing, can you and your Iron 7th Division give an explanation?" Du Xiaoqing was still silent. He didn't open his mouth to explain. "I will explain."
Du Xiaoqing didn't know at the time.
President Pabre looked at the loyal general beside him and continued, "As for the first question, the reason is actually very simple. The Tai family was the most powerful of the 7 families, but it was also the most difficult to see through. Successive governments couldn't even touch its core area. However, this former royal family had the biggest problem. That is, there were very few people. The fact that there was only one heir for several generations. Sometimes people couldn't help but think that maybe this was some kind of punishment and relief from the heavens for the former royal family. The most powerful Thai family of the 7 families was actually the most fragile Thai family. As long as that young man who is called the Crown Prince died, the Thai family would naturally be depressed until it disappeared. President Pabre narrowed his eyes slightly and said slowly, "As for the election that was going on at the time, I believed that the angry and desperate Lady Thai would continue to help me, no matter if it was to vent her emotions or to strike at the murderer she believed to be." He looked at Su Lo and said, "And this kind of help would spare no effort, regardless of the cost." This also meant that no matter what happened, I would win the presidential election. "I always thought that you were a politician, not a politician." After a moment of silence, Su Lo said, "Only now do I know that the thing that constantly leaps and bounds in your chest is still the ambition of a politician. It's not ambition." The president didn't get angry. He explained patiently with a smile, "If it was only for this so-called ambition, then the things that happened afterwards wouldn't have happened. I am the president of the Federation. General Lee Jae-do is the leader of the military. There is also teacher Xiaoqing, including the deceased Byron and those companions. The people in the tavern back then, as well as the new companions that joined later on, already stand at the pinnacle of the Federation's power. Without more power to pursue, what ambition can we have?" President Pabre looked at Su Lo and smiled. His voice was deep and resounding, and it was exceptionally moving. "If we really want to talk about ambition, then our ambition is very simple. It is to completely eliminate the 7 families from the social system of the Federation." There is a very interesting statistical fact. After the Federation and the Empire started the war, the first military academy's reputation and importance were pushed to its current position. The Trinity Association naturally appeared about 60 years ago, but it has several dozen members. In terms of probability, it is a bit strange. There are many members who didn't join our ranks. We didn't force them, and we didn't even make any major requests. I just want to remind you that none of these members have the background of one of the 7 families. So-called geniuses are nothing more than high intelligence combined with hard work that ordinary people can't imagine. Those 7 families have long since infiltrated the Federation society and seized the majority of the top resources. Their children don't need to put in such hard work. The members of the Trinity Association all come from the bottom of society. They innately have the desire and motivation to change the society. President Pabre's expression was solemn. His voice was low and powerful. This system, jointly controlled by the 7 families and politicians, has lasted for 3,772 years since the Federation was established. It has lasted for more than 10,000 years since the collapse of the dynasty and the establishment of the Republic. This system has already become rigid and is in the process of decay. The best era? The worst era? No, the saddest thing is that if you look at the source of history, you will find that all the eras are exactly the same. There is no progress, no development, just a quagmire where everyone is squeezed together and breathing with difficulty. Meanwhile, generation after generation of people with intelligence and creativity will gradually sink into this great quagmire and then die. In the past, there were people who tried to change all of this. For example, those governments that had already been forgotten by the people, for example, that president who was assassinated. Well, death is eternal in the end, the most frightening thing. So, those predecessors and the government were forced to make concessions before the blood and turmoil. A faint mocking smile appeared on President Pabre's face. Then, it quickly disappeared, turning into a sentence that smashed into the ground with a muffled sound. Because of historical reasons, the people of the past didn't find a way to directly confront those 7 families. Now, because of the opportunity of history, this method, or power, has already been firmly grasped in our hands. "You're talking about the army?" Su Lo asked. President Pabre used silence instead of acknowledgement. In the history of the Federation, the army had always been a marginalized and extremely weak group. Because the Federation had no enemies in the universe, the politicians who had ideas always seemed to be so restrained when facing the seven behemoths. However, because of the appearance of the people of the Empire, the Federal Army rapidly expanded and became powerful in the first few decades of the 37th constitutional calendar. Finally, it became a powerful force that could stand on the political stage independently. Su Lo rubbed his forehead hard and couldn't speak for a long time. The people who controlled the Federation government were actually a group of staunch George Carlin activists. This world was too crazy. He seemed to see the terrifying scene of the Federation's major cities and enterprises being vigilantly guarded by armed soldiers in the future, or a few years later. He tightly furrowed his brows. After a long silence, he said, "In Philadelphia, the old man once told me that he went to the Empire and returned to the Federation. He burned his life and every drop of blood to protect the existence of the Federation. It was because he firmly believed that the Federation was a better system than the Empire, and that the people who lived here were happier than the people of the Empire." General Lee Jae-do behind the transparent wall raised his eyebrows slightly and looked at him. "I also think so. Putting aside the relationship of birth and blood, the relationship of invasion and anti-invasion, I fight for the Federation precisely because of this." Su Lo raised his head and looked at the president behind the wall. He said seriously, "Your ideals may be respected and even worshipped by many people of the Federation and the young students of the future, but if the government is really used to relying on the military to solve its internal affairs like a drug, your government will become a military government. You may succeed, but you will fail in the end." President Pabre was silent for a moment and then replied, "I understand your worries, but please believe me. I am not Nanshui. We are not the people of Green Dragon Mountain. We are very calm." "Calm?" Sula stood up and stared at the president's face behind the wall. He asked, "You have never been on the battlefield. You have never fired a gun. Perhaps you have never killed someone with your own hands. You don't know what it feels like to pull the trigger and see a living person's head explode like a watermelon in front of you, with brain matter and blood spraying onto your helmet at close range. You can ask Du Xiaoqing if there is anyone who can maintain absolute calmness on the battlefield. When bullets are fired, when companions and enemies fall, calmness is just a very absurd word, as if it never existed. If the Federation is turned into a battlefield by you people, then there will only be what it should be on the battlefield, and that is slaughter. There may be danger, but it is controllable." President Pabre still displayed extremely terrifying patience and calmness. The most important point is that the government cannot make any concessions to those families right now. Don't worry that Madam in the back of the mountain still has her absurd and outdated ideas. The Westwoods Zhong family controls the military power and does not listen to orders. Those rotten old people are weak and myopic. They cannot see the true danger and are content with controlling everything. Your Group 7 once said, "Why do we have to fight? Because the enemy is there. And now, the people of the Empire are there. These deformed and numb families are here. If we don't fight, the Federation, who is content with the status quo, will one day become the slaves of the Empire. Other than this, can you think of any other way? No, young man, Schiller once said that trash will never walk into a dustbin by itself." This was a famous quote from Schiller. Su Lo had heard Shi Qinghai say it in front of Chao Qiudao's grave. Later, Shi Qinghai rushed into the dustbin like Parliament Hill in order to clean up the trash and died in the square. Hearing the president say this now, he felt terrible, as if he had swallowed a fly. His face was a little pale, and he took 2 steps toward the wall in front of him. He lowered his voice and said angrily, "I don't like the term, young man. This is the reason you killed Zhong Suehu? Because the Westwoods Zhong family did not listen to the Federation, because you want to gather your forces to fight against the Empire?" Sula stared at the president and the other 2 behind the transparent wall and said angrily, "But that guy's been fighting the Empire in the Westwoods for more than 10 years. When the Tiger was fighting on the front line, what were you doing? General Lee Jae-do, you used the pressure of the god of war Halo as an excuse to hide in the First Academy to teach and cultivate the ambitious successor. Du Xiaoqing, you were practicing. You repeated the practice day after day, cursing the student who was the real hero behind his back. And what about you, Mr. President? You kept on going to court to build your reputation, running for parliament, and making those touching but fucking useless speeches. Su Lu faced the transparent and cold wall and said with a hoarse voice, "You gave the ancient clock to the Empire's fleet, and you killed him. This is betrayal. This is betrayal." Chapter 755. President Pabre, who was the most eloquent when he was a lawyer, whose speech was the most touching after he participated in politics, and who was still able to speak calmly and clearly at such a moment, finally quieted down for the first time after Su Li's question. Between his thick eyebrows, in his exceptionally firm eyes, there was a faint trace of sadness. Was it because he would occasionally think of the fireworks in the Night Scorpion Nebula and feel guilty? Noticing the president's expression, Su Li's lips moved slightly. He wanted to say something, but in the end, he could only helplessly and sadly spread out his hands. He had heard the president mention that at the dinner at the official residence, the president and Zhong Sugo had a fierce argument at the dinner table. The two people had very different views on many things regarding the invasion of the empire. Zhong Sugo was wary of the Federation government's attempt to weaken the local military forces in the Westwoods, and did not agree that the 4th Military Region should be the main force to attack the empire under the current circumstances. It was probably after this argument that President Pabre finally made up his mind. He officially put the conspiracy plan that had been in motion for a long time and was only waiting for approval on the stage with space as the backdrop. It turned out that it was a Last Supper. Sula stood alone on the other side of the transparent wall, his hands weakly spread out beside his body. When he killed Macklin and was locked up in the military prison of Chingcheng, the old man was still fishing in Philadelphia and had never seen him. The entire Federation was silent, and the leaders of the 7 major families wanted him dead immediately. Only the president and the tiger in the Westwoods clearly showed an attitude of protection, but in the end, Mr. President, do you still remember the speech at the Nebula Awards that year? After that, I specially came to look at it. Su Lu raised his head and looked at President Pabre behind the wall. He said softly, "At that time, regarding the Macklin incident, you once said a few words. When a person dies, it is not as good as when the light is extinguished. The light has light, and the place that it cannot illuminate is darkness. If you do something wrong, you must pay the price." Then you said, "Perhaps I'm not a mature politician, but I'm a devoted believer of the Federation's laws. If I die, you can dig up my grave and see what color it is. I have the same attitude towards certain dead people." Silence reigned in the room. Sula paused for a moment before asking, "You're not dead yet, but it seems that we can ask you in advance. When you decided to sell the lives of Commander Zhong, his wife and the soldiers on the antique bell to the Imperial fleet, where was the law of the Federation that you respected? What color will your future grave be? If you did something wrong, shouldn't you pay the price?" President Pabre pursed his thick lips, his lower jaw showing a few deep hollows. After a long silence, he replied, "I admit that I have done some things that are beyond my limits. However, for the sake of this Federation, the price I will have to pay must be paid later. I have long been mentally prepared to be judged by history." Sula looked at him and said sarcastically, "If we let history judge us, the Imperial Expeditionary Force can also say that we don't need to resist. Medellin can also say that we don't need to pay attention to him. Commander Zhong has more reason to say that. Mr. President, don't you think that this statement is shameless and hypocritical? If only history is qualified to judge you, then how are you qualified to judge others?" At this point in the conversation, Su Li's words had finally succeeded in infuriating him. He slowly stood up from his chair and walked to the transparent wall. He looked at Su Lu, who was right in front of him but far away in the sky, and said word by word, "Su Lu, don't worry. Shameless? Hypocritical? Colonel Su Lu, please don't forget that you also used the pen that stabbed into your throat to judge Medellin without being convicted by the court." Separated by the transparent and cold wall, Su Le and President Pobre stood face to face. They opened their eyes without blinking and looked into each other's eyes. President Pobre pointed at Su Le's face and said with a sullen face, "Your experience should let you know better than most people that the law of the Federation can't perfectly protect the weak. Most of the time, it can only protect the powerful to escape the punishment they deserve. That's why the Medellin case was stopped, and the Ministry of Justice is in a terrible state. That's why you played the role of judge yourself. The government of the Federation is an elected government. Facing the danger of the Empire's invasion, it has to be constantly vigilant against the warlords of the Westwoods. Don't the Zhong family and the other families have broken the law? But which district attorney would be able to successfully send them to prison? The Federation has the glory of the Charter, but in front of these powerful people who have countless scapegoats and are even used to carrying scapegoats around with them and responding to the Charter at any time, what is the law?" Sulu looked at the president's angry accusation and narrowed his eyes. Because of the words, scapegoats, and the glory of the Charter, he thought of the knife glinting on Tiger Mountain Road and the district procuratorate full of peach blossoms in spring many years ago. He silently admitted that what the president said was true. When you killed Medellin, you didn't need the law to prepare for you. What right do you have to ask the government to do so? President Pobre looked at him with a solemn expression and said, "The reason why I admire you and Shi Qinghai is because of your attitude in doing things, and this is also the attitude that I will live with in my life. Evil must pay the price. In order to practice the ultimate fairness and justice, kind people should do whatever it takes, because morality is a fragile thing that needs to be carefully protected by strength. When I was expelled from the law firm because of a public interest lawsuit, and my wife and I were laughed at and chased out of our house, wandering the snowy streets with a broken box, looking for a small dark house to rent, I confirmed this. Even if I were to be buried in a grave in the future, I would have a clear conscience." President Pobre's anger gradually calmed down because of these words. He put his broad palm on the transparent wall and looked at Sulu with extreme calmness. "We are not the Knights of Concern in Schiller's words, and we are not radical. We don't plan to use the army to madly sweep everything, but when the reform of the Federation encounters the desperate struggle of those families, the army will be the most powerful protection of the Federation government. We have a very long-term detailed plan. The current government has already pushed the parliament to pass the Golden Fusion algorithm. In the next 5 years, my companions and I will use the current situation of the war to push for the passage of more bills. In the plan, the government and I will introduce the Affirmative Action Act, the Double Ring Health Insurance Act, the Income Tax Amendment Act, and then the government will work hard to pass the Fund Share Exchange Act." President Pobre slightly raised his chin, and his eyes were firm and deep. The previous governments have never been able to figure out how much resources the 7 families control through those foundations that are as numerous as fish in the sea. They can hide from the government surveillance and can exert a fatal influence on the industries that are related to the safety of the Federation. These things must be done during my term. George Carlin said that information asymmetry is the root of the unfairness of the Federation society. What we want to do is to open up this information and let the ordinary citizens of the Federation carry out the most effective and direct supervision. Sula, don't worry that the Federation government will become a military government. We will welcome a brand new, real elected government. Pobre withdrew his gaze and looked calmly at the silent Sula. He said, "You have contributed to the Federation. I don't want to give you any unfair treatment. I only hope that you can calm down, stand on the highest level, and consider the interests of the people of the Federation. I know that this sounds like a utopia that only exists in people's fantasies, but the ideal has never been so close to reality as it is today. This is the Federation's best chance. We are idealists? Liberals? Pragmatists? No, we are all people who insist on what is right and fight to the end." President Pobre looked at Sula and said in a low voice, "We are all the same in our bones. We are just a stinky and hard rock from Donglin." The president raised his right arm and pointed at Li Jiedu and Du Xiaoqing beside him. His calm and infectious gaze pierced through the invisible wall and fell on Su Li's face. Join us, Su Li. Has that day really come? No, will that day really come? Su Li listened in silence and subconsciously thought about it. He did not voice his doubts. He suddenly felt that his brain could not wrap itself around it. So, the person who killed Macklin and the people he hated were the same kind of people deep down in their bones? But how could Macklin be equated with that tiger? On your path, many people who have died are innocent, he said with a frown and a slightly hoarse voice. This is not right. There is never perfect justice in the world, President Pobre said quietly. For a long-term goal, there will always be people who need to sacrifice. Su Li silently recalled Professor Shen's words in his heart. There was never any reason in the universe, so he asked, then why is it not you or me who sacrificed? President Pobre was silent for a moment and then said, Schiller once wrote a legendary novel in his early years. The novel described a war that surrounded Xiangqing. In his later years, he wrote another novel, The Story of the Soldier, which described the innocent people who were used as shields by the hero during the war. The soldier's death saved the hero of Xiangqing and indirectly saved hundreds of thousands of people. However, to him, it was such a tragedy. I think this story can answer your previous question. I have read this story. In my opinion, the soldier's death was not a sacrifice because no one asked for his opinion. That is the source of the tragedy. Su Li narrowed his eyes and said, similarly, you did not ask the waitress in the Linhai State Gymnasium whether the soldiers of the Westwoods on the ancient bell were willing to die for your grand plan. So, this is not a sacrifice. It is still murder. Then, in the Golden Foundation building, those special task force agents who died under the guns of you and Shi Qinghai, should they be considered as sacrifices or were they murdered by you? President Pobre's eyes suddenly became extremely sharp, and the pressure was enough to stare into Su Li's eyes. He asked in a deep voice, if those innocent special task force agents can be sacrificed in your eyes, then why can't Zhong Suahu and the others be sacrificed for the Federation? This was a very sharp and direct interrogation. Su Li narrowed his eyes and suddenly contracted his pupils. After a long silence, he tightly pursed his lips and looked up. He said, a few years ago, on the Iron Tower, I once said to a girl that the justice that needs to be obtained by sacrificing innocent people is not justice. Then what is the difference between us and you? The difference is that Shi Qinghai and I have never had the subjective intention to harm innocent people, including those special task force agents in the Golden Foundation building. Maybe this sounds like sophistry to you, because whether there is subjective intention or not, the result is the same death. But just like what I thought in the Snow Queen Charter Square, I always insist that the motive is more important than the result. Chapter 756. Motives, Results, Fairness, and Justice. President Pobre frowned and stared into his eyes. Before I decided to pardon you, Lady Tai wanted to kill you. The master of the Li family wanted to kill you, and even the two justices of the Supreme Court expressed their opposition. Where do you think the Federation's fairness and justice was at that time? Mr. President, you are the most outstanding orator in the Federation. I don't expect to be able to convince you of anything. I only hope to be able to convince myself. After a pause, Su Li said, I've already said too much tonight, even more than what I usually say in a month. Let's stop here for now. Although he stopped here, he still frowned and continued to speak. Looking at the people behind the transparent wall, he sighed emotionally. I was prepared to get married, but it looks like I won't be able to in a short time. It's also possible that I won't be able to get married for the rest of my life. I'm really a bit disappointed. He looked at Li Jiedu and asked, what would your father think? What would your son think if he did? With a sliver of complicated emotion, he looked at President Pobre and asked, do you really know who George Carlin is? It's easy to think of the meeting room in prison. He gently patted the transparent wall in front of him and said, it's just that I can't be sure at the moment whether I'm the prisoner or you guys. In the end, Sulu said, "You can shoot now." The top-secret phone in the confidential room of the official residence rang. President Pabre picked up the receiver and listened silently. He could faintly hear words like second sequence. It looked like this call was from the Bureau of Proclamation. After hanging up the phone, President Pabre looked at Sulu quietly for a long time. Suddenly, he said, "I never wanted to execute you. The Federation government will arrest you as a fugitive and put you on trial." Back then, the Bureau of Proclamation and the Westwoods Military District's arrest in the Westwoods never stopped. And you probably haven't forgotten the warrant for your arrest. Because of the appearance of the marshal, I haven't had time to issue an official pardon. Following the silent order, the special elite soldiers who had been silently waiting in the corridor on the second floor of the presidential residence for a long time began to move. In the shortest amount of time, they broke through the two wooden doors that had long been listed as cultural relics. There was a loud boom. The soldiers rushed in at high speed with high-powered firearms. Their fingers nervously pressed against the warm triggers, and the black muzzles did not leave Sulu's body for a moment. During this process, Sulu was surprisingly calm and didn't make any attempts to resist. Because he knew that as long as he made any movement that would arouse the suspicion of these soldiers, they would definitely not hesitate to shoot at him. Perhaps the people behind the transparent wall were waiting for his resistance because the Federation government needed a reason to execute him, so he couldn't give them a reason. Sulu silently raised his hands and allowed these elite Special Forces soldiers to rush in front of him. He twisted his arms and fastened the super-strong wrist restraints. His ankles were closed with heavy metal positioning valves. Then, he was tied layer by layer to a special metal frame like S3's special product, Zongzi. The metal frame moved horizontally and vertically like a cross. The cold and thick frame pressed tightly against his spine. Because of the tight movements of the Special Forces soldiers, the part of his back that was in contact with the metal frame felt a cold pain, but it successfully made his posture appear even straighter, and his chin was raised even higher. After the two most careful confirmations, confirming that the restraints, the super-strong restraints on his wrists, and the heavy metal positioning valves on his ankles were enough to prevent a real prehistoric monster from moving an inch, these elite Special Forces soldiers from the Capital Garrison Guard 1st Division finally let out a sigh of relief, and the strange and tense atmosphere in the study of the official residence finally faded a little. The Federal Army was a place that respected the strong. Over the years, all the soldiers knew that the strongest of the younger generation in the army were Sulu and Li Feng. Especially after Sulu launched a surprise attack on the Empire and returned safely, his reputation in the army had become even more resounding. These elite Special Forces soldiers, who were usually incomparably proud and self-proclaimed, did not have any pride or confidence in front of Sulu. They were full of vigilance and even reverence, nervous and worried that if he really did resist, how many people would die before this room truly quieted down. During the entire process, Sulu did not resist or even take the initiative to make any moves. However, the nervous Special Forces soldiers did not fight back, but it was as if they had just experienced the most difficult battle. Their expressions were forced to remain calm, but their combat uniforms were already soaked. Before being pushed out of the severely damaged door of the study, Sulu, who was tightly bound to the metal cross, narrowed his eyes and looked at the cup of jasmine tea on the table from the corner of his eyes. He asked the transparent wall, "Is this cup of tea poisoned?" After learning the details of Shi Qinghai's accident from Zhang Xiaoming last night, he had not drunk a single drop of liquid that was not processed by him. Therefore, he did not drink a single sip of this cup of jasmine tea. At this moment, he was very curious to know Mr. President's answer. President Pabre frowned, and a faint tiredness and disappointment appeared in his calm and deep eyes. He did not answer his question. Because of his silence, Sulu's slightly narrowed eyes also showed a faint tiredness and disappointment. The high-authority communication system on the desk continued to send out reports. Sulu had been escorted out of the corridor, downstairs, and onto the lawn. He had been escorted into a specially modified armored vehicle and was then handed over to the Iron 7th Division stationed on the west side of the square. The transparent wall between the study and the confidential room of the president's official residence had been retracted back into the structure of the building. President Pabre, Li Jiedu, and Du Xiaoqing listened to the voice from the desk in silence. After a moment, Li Jiedu looked up and calmly looked at Mr. President's dark and tired face. "I know what you want to say." President Pabre frowned slightly and said, "This young man is not an ordinary person. He is the successor, personally chosen by the general. He is a hero in the hearts of the people of the Federation. He is not an ordinary person. You can't just casually kill him." Li Jiedu frowned slightly and was about to raise his objection. President Pabre raised his hand to stop him and continued to explain in a deep voice, "If he dies like this, aren't you worried that the soldiers in the army will be suspicious and disheartened? And because of the Parliament Hill and Lake, those families have already begun to be wary of us. If Su Lu really dies, Lady Tai and the old people like Li Yuan Palace will definitely use this as an excuse to do something that we don't want to see. The most important thing is..." Mr. President stood up and lowered his head to adjust the bow tie on his neck. He calmly said, "Before the operation just now, I received a call from Director Cui. The Federal Central Computer has already issued the third sequence of security warnings. This warning is aimed directly at Su Lu." He raised his head and narrowed his eyes slightly. "This is the problem of the first sequence of security that you have been investigating. I have been thinking if the Federal Central Computer believes that Su Lu is so important to the Federation, then it would be the greatest irresponsibility to the Federation for us to casually end his life." General Li Jiedu silently thought for a moment. He smiled and shook his head. After whispering a few words, he left the study of the official residence with Du Xiaoqing. The two wooden doors of the study had long been broken. The curtains that were tied to the door lock by Su Lu with professional skills did indeed firmly secure the position of the lock. However, there was no way to prevent the special forces from directly smashing two large holes in the door. President Pabre sat behind the desk. Looking at the two holes and the clear and sharp old wood stubble, he unconsciously frowned and fell into a strange silence. He was the most powerful man in the Federation. However, when he sat alone in the study and could no longer see the young man he had always felt familiar with for some reason, he felt a little lonely. The lonely silence lasted for a long time until Brin, the director of the office, walked in cautiously. President Pabre didn't seem to hear what he said clearly. He subconsciously nodded and then got up to leave. Before leaving the study, he looked at the cup of jasmine tea on the table and suddenly stopped. He picked up the already cold tea and took a big sip. He felt a lot calmer than Amoir. President pushed open the bedroom door, but was greeted with a loud slap in the face. He was a little tired and didn't react. He only had time to slightly move his body so that the angry and disappointed palm hit the bottom of his face. Then, when the palm fell again, he forcefully grabbed the other person's hand. "What are you doing?" President Pabre stared into his wife's eyes and asked in shock. "Su Lu is a good young man. You can't do this." The president's wife's face was full of tears. Her makeup was a mess, revealing the wrinkles at the corners of her eyes. It was very obvious that she didn't sleep at all tonight. She lowered her voice and cried out with great pain, "He was caught by you to save you. Are you letting him down? Are you letting your conscience down?" President Pabre felt a numbing sensation surge into his mind. He stared angrily into his wife's eyes and roared like an enraged lion, "You don't understand anything. You don't understand." "What don't I understand?" The president's wife angrily pulled back her hand and said sorrowfully, "You know Li Jiedu's personality. Back then I cooked noodles for you every night. I also know his personality. He will definitely kill Su Lu immediately. He will kill him immediately." President Pabre furrowed his brows tightly. His brows were like the Chinese character Sichuan, like a river with an unknown destination. He knew that his wife was telling the truth, and he didn't want to think about whether he was pretending not to know or tacitly admitting that this had happened. At this time, The president's wife did notice that their poor autistic daughter was staring at them from the door. Padil's light brown eyes were filled with sadness and disappointment. She was no longer innocent. Chapter 757. Li Jiedu and Du Xiaoqing walked out of the official residence and were greeted by several officers with solemn expressions. These officers were from several powerful forces near the capital's special district. They shared a common trait with Du Xiaoqing, which was that they were young and sharp, with stars shining on their epaulets. The young generals saluted their teachers, their eyes burning with calmness. Although they knew that this spring night was not a real operation, there was no doubt that it was the prelude to a major change. They followed the great statesman in the official residence and had stepped onto the stage of history, so they would never leave before the curtain fell on their lives. After a brief conversation and briefing, the generals led their direct subordinates and quickly left. Only Li Jiedu and Du Xiaoqing were left on the lawn. After a short silence, General Li Jiedu frowned slightly. Looking at the street that had returned to normal, he said, "Actually, Mr. President's concerns were just reasons he found for himself. To kill or not to kill is just a matter of thought. Sometimes you don't need to think too much." Du Xiaoqing did not respond. He put on his sunglasses and remained silent. In fact, this night, he and his Iron 7th Division took on the most critical task of arresting Su Le. However, after entering the official residence, he did not say a word. Li Jiedu glanced at him and said with a smile, "It is indeed a very difficult decision to destroy the passionate, naive, and hot-blooded version of myself when I was young." The meaning of this sentence was obvious. In his opinion, President Pabre did not agree to execute Su Le immediately. It had nothing to do with the danger that those families might take advantage of the situation. It even had nothing to do with Su Li's puzzling first-order authority in the charter. It was purely because of the emotions of the current him looking at the past him. No matter how experienced and calm a schemer was, there was a period when they were young where they were passionate, naive, and often hot-blooded and angry. President Pabre was like this. Then what about Li Jiedu himself? Su Le is an extremely dangerous person. Because of the issue of authority, he is even more dangerous than the evaluation of all the members of the association. In my opinion, he is even more dangerous than the hidden forces of the 7 families. Because his danger is too direct. General Li Jiedu continued expressionlessly, "Our cause cannot bear this kind of risk. In the face of simple and direct violence, we cannot retreat in the slightest. Du Xiaoqing, take care of this matter." He looked at Du Xiaoqing and said, "Don't think too much about the impact. As long as we leave the area of the president's official residence and the square, we can find a suitable reason for any accidental death." The sunglasses on Du Xiaoqing's nose reflected the dim light of the official residence in the spring night. After a moment of silence, he said, "I need an order from Mr. President. We are soldiers. We have the right to make decisions on the battlefield. And as long as Su Le is there, it is usually a battlefield." Li Jiedu's calm and oppressive gaze directly pierced through the lens of his sunglasses and fell on Du Xiaoqing's eyes. He continued, "Killing a hero of the Federation who is deeply loved by the people is a crime that is destined to be written in history. If you insist that the president give the order directly, then it is equivalent to you convicting him in advance." Du Xiaoqing was silent for a moment, then saluted and said, "I will definitely complete the mission." The troops that came in armored vehicles left in armored vehicles. There were more than 10 members of Group 7 who could not escape at all. Charter Square, which was filled with a tense and solemn atmosphere before, almost instantly returned to silence and desolation. At the entrance of the buildings along the street, several second lieutenants were smiling and explaining something to the residents, telling them the good news of the end of the anti-terrorism exercise. At the same time, they handed over the gift packages specially prepared by the Ministry of National Defense. The residents expressed their magnanimity for disturbing their dreams. Occasionally, green leaves fell and rolled on the street, and a few lonely stars hung in the night sky. Under the dim starlight, the bronze statue of the Group of Five and the statue of the military god looked at each other without saying a word. The spring night was like yesterday, and the night wind was as usual. The troops that participated in this secret military operation quickly left Charter Square and went through the reserve military ramp, passing through the civilian buildings on the ground, and sometimes crossing the half-elevated Bering Bridge, as quietly as possible to the camp in the suburbs. A convoy drove from the president's residence just past the Ministry of Finance building and drove out of Charter Square. All the armored vehicles had been specially modified, all the remote control chips were removed, and even the most important control valves were adjusted to manual operation priority. A first lieutenant of the Iron 7th Division looked at the small-eyed man who was tied to the cross-alloy frame at the bottom of the dark armored vehicle and suppressed the shock and confusion in his heart. He tightly held the high-powered, short-barreled gun in his hand and silently thought, "Is it because of this guy that the Army carried out these modifications in advance?" The soldiers of the Federation all knew how amazing this guy was, and his research on the mechanical electronic control system was to the extreme. But why did the superior order to remove the remote control system? Was he really so amazing that he could use these things to escape the escort of hundreds of elite soldiers? Not to mention that his hands and feet were already equipped with super-strong magnetic shackles. No matter how powerful he was, he should be desperate now, right? He actually smiled. That guy actually smiled. So scary. The first lieutenant opened his eyes wide and looked at the guy at the bottom of the armored vehicle in disbelief. He subconsciously raised the gun in his hand and pointed it at the guy's head. Almost at the same time, the specially selected elites of the Iron 7th Division were collectively shocked by that inexplicable smile, and their pupils shrank, and they raised the guns in their hands. Su Lo, whose body was tightly bound by the new technology of the Federation, was leaning against the cross-alloy frame. At this moment, he couldn't even move a finger. Fortunately, the enemies weren't violent enough to control his facial nerves, so he could still grin, revealing his neat and white teeth, and smile until his eyes were squinted, and one knew what time it was. In a corner of the base of the Federation's first military district located in the suburbs of the capital, a very strange scene appeared. The heavy alloy door of the armory slowly opened, and more than 10 of the most advanced black MX mechas of the Federation activated together. They slowly drove out in the middle of the night, exuding an extremely austere aura. After the Iron 7th Division returned from the front lines of the Empire, they didn't return to S3. Instead, they stayed in S1. As a result, this base became the temporary base of this invincible and iron-blooded division. As one of the first 2 full mecha divisions of the Federation, hundreds of military mechas silently parked in the empty warehouse like metal statues. They hadn't made a sound for many days, until today. The officer of the logistics department of the division looked at the black MX mechas that disappeared into the night like ghosts. He couldn't help but frown and shake his head. He lowered his head and quickly sketched out the relevant procedures with a digital pen. His heart was filled with countless questions and shock, but because of the strict military discipline, he didn't dare to ask. Tonight, the Iron 7th Division seemed to be carrying out a secret military mission. They had continuously mobilized a large number of armored troops and military mechas. The problem was, this wasn't the front lines, but the capital's special district. What kind of mission would require such a large amount of firepower? The military MX mechas glowing with a black metallic luster drove out of the base in low-impedance mode. They drove along the special military road to the city where the lights were still flashing and gradually disappeared into the darkness of the night. At this moment, the high-grade light absorption paint developed by the Nutshell Engineering Department painted these tall and heavy mechas with a layer of ghostly feeling. Before the ghostly military mechas entered the defense circle of the capital's special district, they received the expected strict questioning. Since the assassination at the Lin High State Gymnasium, the thermal start band monitoring network of mechas spread all over the major cities of the Federation had already captured the silhouettes of these military mechas. However, the Department of National Defense in charge of the military Mecca's location monitoring only received a brief explanation from the other party after sending out the strict questioning. Secret military mission. The nervous and shocked officials of the Department of National Defense were preparing to order the standby Federation fighter jets to immediately take off to intercept them when they once again received an electronic document from the Black MX Mechas. This electronic document proved that these Black MX Mechas had the highest level of authority from the Federation government and the military. No department, including the Department of National Defense, had the right to stop them from entering the city that was still lit in the middle of the night, but was still sleeping soundly. The armored fleet moved relatively slowly, gradually increasing the distance between them and the troops in front. Not long after they drove out of the Charter Square area, an order was passed through the encrypted command system to the armored vehicle in the middle. After the first lieutenant received the order, he raised his head and glanced at Su Lo with a complicated expression. Unable to completely hide the shock in his heart, the right hand that held the gun silently slipped his index finger into the trigger holster. He couldn't understand this unbelievable order. The officer tied to the alloy frame was a hero of the Federation with outstanding military achievements, the successor personally chosen by the war god, the role model and idol in the hearts of countless Federation soldiers, but in the end, he was going to be executed by himself on the spot? As an officer of the Iron 7th Division, he had executed many incomprehensible orders on the battlefield. Later on, facts continuously proved that this approach was correct. Not to mention, the order he received tonight was directly from his commander. The first lieutenant and his companions looked at each other and saw the shock and uneasiness in each other's eyes. The Iron 7th Division had always been known for its strict discipline. From the commander Du Shaoqing to the most common logistician, they had the strictest self-requirements on the battlefield. They were cold, proud, stubborn, and strong. To be able to make an officer of the Iron 7th Division feel shocked, uneasy, and even confused when facing an order from a superior as the target of execution, Su Lo should feel very comforted. Colonel Su Lo, I'm sorry. The first lieutenant swallowed hard and looked at the bottom of the car. He raised the gun in his hand and aimed it at the person tied to the cross. Chapter 758. The muzzle was raised, then lowered. In the end, the lieutenant and the officer beside him did not pull the trigger. Su Lo, who should have felt comforted by their hesitation, should feel even more comforted. Although the people in the military were used to seeing life and death, when faced with someone like Su Lo, they still could not so easily decide his life and death. Probably sensing that something had happened in the car, the 20 or so armored vehicles that were slowly moving forward stopped in a small square in the middle of an empty commercial building. The door of the car opened, and an officer of the Iron 7th Division walked in with a cold expression. After confirming the situation, he frowned and stared at the lieutenant who had been specially chosen to carry out the mission. He coldly said, "If you don't have a good reason, I think the commander will be very satisfied with your previous actions." Hearing the words commander, the lieutenant, who had put down his gun, began to breathe rapidly. His eyes were bloodshot from the struggle. He laughed somewhat self-deprecatingly and slowly said, "Back then at Yellow Mountain Ridge, I was only a squad leader. If it wasn't for Colonel Su Lo controlling the MX, my entire squad would have been trampled into meat paste by the Empire's mechas." The lieutenant shook his head and calmly said, "Sir, I'm very sorry, but I can't do it." The high-ranking officer was silent for a moment. He waved his hand and signaled for the officer behind him to drag the lieutenant out. After a moment of silence, he suddenly raised his head and looked at Su Lo with a cold gaze. "Instructor, we're soldiers. We have to obey the orders of our superiors. Please understand." Hearing the term instructor, Su Lo narrowed his eyes and looked over. In the dim light, he clearly saw the officer's face. He was relieved. This person was not Zhou Yu, but the officer with the surname Chong, whose right leg he had smashed on the field back then. "This is just a small interlude." Major Chong looked at him mockingly. You don't need to be too surprised. No matter what, there will be someone who will send you to that dark world. No one will allow you to walk out of this armored vehicle. As his voice fell, the small square of the commercial district under the night sky suddenly rang out with a very low roar. These low rumbling sounds came from the darkness between the buildings, shaking people's eardrums, shaking the ground slightly, and shaking the billboards on the street as if they were being blown by a strong wind, extremely uneasy. Major Chong frowned as he looked out. At the same time, the soldiers of the Iron 7th Division on the armored vehicles also looked out warily. For them, who had been through hundreds of battles on the battlefield, this sound was all too familiar. Every time the smoke rose and the Empire's bullets rained down, as long as they heard this low rumble, they would feel much calmer and more confident. This was because this was the unique rumble of the dual engines of the Federation's military MX mecha. However, as they were carrying out a secret military mission tonight, when they heard this familiar rumble of mecha engines, their hearts were filled with infinite nervousness. This was because in the original plan, not a single mecha from the Iron 7th Division had been mobilized. Then, where did these mecha coming from in the darkness of the night come from? The officers inside and outside the armored vehicle that Su Lo was in, as well as the few officers who knew the details of tonight's mission, very naturally connected the dots. They abruptly became alert and quickly ordered the entire fleet to enter a strategic state. Everyone knew that Su Lo was the designer of the MX mecha, and the 17th Armored Division he was in, along with the Iron 7th Division, were the only two divisions of the Federation military that were fully integrated with mecha. Could it be that these mecha lurking in the darkness, approaching at high speed, were from the 17th Armored Division? More than 10 completely black military MX mecha suddenly appeared from the darkness of the night like specters. From the streets and alleys surrounding the small square, they charged towards the fleet at high speed. The group of black mecha that had already transformed into their human forms were silent and solemn, instantly transforming from specters into invincible steel giants. The armored combat team of the Iron 7th Division felt as if those black shadows that were far taller than the streetlights were a tangible fear that enveloped their hearts and loomed over their heads. At this moment, they felt as if they had returned to the battlefield on Planet 33-20-54-60, where the flames of war raged. No, it was even scarier than that, because they were facing the most powerful MX mecha of the Federation. What made the soldiers of the Iron 7th Division feel the most incomparably cold was that, due to the special requirements of tonight's secret military mission, all of the armored vehicles' remote control systems and automatic fire systems had been modified. In this extremely short period of time, there was no way they could make an effective response at all. Identity confirmed. Identity confirmed. The communications officer of the armored combat team shouted at the mecha charging at them at high speed through the system. At the same time, he quickly activated the battlefield identification system. Major Chung solemnly stared at the command terminal on his wrist. After a few seconds, his expression suddenly relaxed. The black MX mecha still didn't slow down their charging speed, nor did they respond to the call of the Iron 7th Division. However, the MX mecha quickly transmitted a series of codes into the identification system. Every division of the Federation had their own unique battlefield codes. According to the chaotic operation mode developed by the Federal Academy of Science, the codes were automatically updated 24 hours a day. This kind of top-secret code could only be fully matched by the people of the division. Even the high-ranking departments of the Department of National Defense couldn't copy this code before the complete battlefield system was activated. Major Chong was very sure that this group of black mecha that had appeared out of the darkness was the mecha of the Iron 7 Division. He immediately ordered all the combat personnel to stop attacking to prevent the absurd scene of them fighting each other. Thick confusion and doubt surged into his mind. When had the division sent a group of black mecha over? Why did the pilots not respond to his own shouts in the system? Most importantly, what were they here for? From the corner of his eye, he saw Su Lo tied to an alloy frame in the dark corner of the armored vehicle. Major Chong vaguely guessed the answer. He couldn't help but frown. Could the division use this kind of method to hide it from the Department of National Defense and the 17th Division? What kind of person was Instructor Su Le? Why did they mobilize so many mecha to kill him? At that time, the situation had changed so quickly that no one had time to keep up with it. Naturally, there was no time to think. Less than 3 seconds after the Iron 7 Division's armored vehicles received the order not to shoot, more than 10 black MXs from the surrounding streets rushed into the small square where the armored vehicles were located. The black mecha at the front raised its heavy mechanical arm without hesitation and smashed it down viciously at one of the armored vehicles. With a loud boom, the soft tracks of the armored vehicle were shattered into pieces. Smoke and dust shot out from the bottom of the vehicle as if it was about to fly. In fact, after being struck by the black mecha, the sturdy cabin of the armored vehicle was suddenly flattened and then stubbornly sprang up from the ground. It really did look like a small spaceship that was about to take off. The officers of the Iron 7th Division in the armored vehicle were knocked out of the cabin. Their bodies were bruised all over. Although there were no fatal injuries, they were still a little dazed by the terrifying attack. Especially Major Chong, who was sent flying by the shockwave to the side of the street next to a trash can. He stared in shock at the tall black mecha not far in front of him. He thought to himself that even if it was an act to hide from the investigation, these mecha were too dangerous. Under the heavy blow of the black mecha's mechanical arm, although the sturdy armored vehicle was severely deformed, it surprisingly didn't fall apart. Only the most fragile part of the armor at the top of the vehicle was torn apart by the tremendous force. With a second heavy blow from the black mecha, the crack was directly torn apart. The deformed armor plate flew miserably far away and landed heavily on the street with a muffled thud. Su Le, who was tied tightly to the metal frame, fell heavily and landed on the ground. There was a bloody cut on the side of his face. Suddenly, he found that the armor plate on top of his head had disappeared. He couldn't help but squint. The sparse stars in the night sky. He hadn't seen them for only a few hours, but it felt like centuries had passed. The 2 moons were nowhere to be seen. Could it be that you couldn't bear to watch this vicious massacre? The black MX mecha stood in front of the armored vehicle. It was like a giant looking down coldly at the toy car that a child was riding in. If it wanted to, it could trample this toy car into pieces at any time. With a sharp sound, a sharp alloy blade popped out from the front end of the black mech's right arm. The blade spun quickly, emitting a cold light. Then, it swung down heavily into the armored vehicle. The cold blade, which seemed to be larger than a human's body, ruthlessly slashed at Su Le's immobile body. It was like a giant weapon used by an ancient god, mercilessly slashing at a lowly kitten. Su Le didn't seem to see the giant alloy blade coming at him at all. He narrowed his eyes and looked at the starry sky through the narrowing gap. Perhaps he knew that this was the last time he would see it, so his gaze was exceptionally calm, but also a little greedy. At this moment, the small plaza of the commercial district under the cover of the thick night seemed to have sunk into absolute silence. The black MX mecha that had invaded the inner circle of the armored fleet still had their engines roaring. All the sounds had disappeared. The soldiers of the Iron 7 Division had complicated expressions as they looked at the heavily damaged armored vehicle and the gleam of the alloy blade that shone with a desolate light in the night. They knew that someone was about to die. They roughly understood that the story of a certain hero would end tonight. The heavy alloy blade of the mecha slid past Su Le's eyes, past the tip of his nose, and then viciously slashed between his legs, sending up a spray of unusually bright sparks. No one could describe the accuracy of this attack, or rather, the precision of this attack. The difficulty of this attack was like a person holding a kitchen knife and accurately slicing sesame seeds on a chopping board into 2 perfect semicircles. If one considered that this kind of operation was done by a clumsy mecha from the conventional concept, one could imagine the fearsomeness of this attack. Even Su Le himself would not be able to execute such a perfect attack at any time and place. Then came 2 crisp sounds. The The tall black MX was like a cold killer, swinging its alloy blade into the armored vehicle, accurately chopping at the hard joints of the alloy frame. No matter how strong the shackles were, in front of the black mecha's heavy and crazy chopping, they were as fragile as a young girl's straw bracelet. Sulu narrowed his eyes and took a deep breath. His chest suddenly rose and fell. The layers of restraints on his body instantly tore apart with a hiss. The shards of the high-density fiber restraints fluttered in the air under the streetlights and dim starlight like butterflies breaking out of their cocoons. Chapter 759. Sulu stood up like a butterfly breaking out of its cocoon. Of course, he didn't have that kind of slender beauty. The broken shackles and alloy frame only gave him a sense of valiance. In a space where no one could hear, the old man's voice rang out, "Are you afraid of death? Of course you are. Then why didn't you even blink? Because I have you. Why should I be afraid? No one can kill me unless I want to kill myself." The night wind in the small square of the commercial district suddenly heated up. The engines of more than 10 black MX mechas roared, and their posture quickly changed. Their powerful mechanical arms pushed horizontally towards the armored vehicles beside them. The mechanical movements of these black mechs appeared to be somewhat clumsy and not smooth enough. However, whether it was the choice of strength or angle, they were exceptionally precise. Under the premise that they did not cause terrifying damage, they accurately pushed all the armored vehicles to the sides of the street. The entire process looked just like that famous game of box pushing for young children. The armored vehicles and the ground ground violently, producing an ear-piercing sound and dazzling sparks. They collided with the artificial undulations on both sides of the street, shaking up and then falling back down. The soldiers of the Iron 7th Division finally reacted. Under Major Chang's furious order, they pulled the triggers and fired at the central area of the small square of the commercial district. Bang, 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 bang. The dull sound of high-speed bullets hitting the alloy frame rang out. Countless dazzling bullet flames instantly lit up the streets of this spring night. The high firepower guns on the armored vehicles on the periphery spat out bullets, accurately turning the central area of the square into a swamp of death. What was very strange was that after the black mechas pushed the armored vehicles away and occupied the central area of the square, they didn't immediately return the fierce fire of the Iron 7th Division. The black mechas knelt down on their heavy mechanical legs and formed a circle, exposing their backs to the bullets of the Iron 7th Division's guns. After that, they didn't do anything else. Howling bullets rained down on the backs and mechanical legs of the black mecha, emitting ear-piercing sounds of metal cracking. From time to time, shards of metal that could not be determined whether they were bullets or mecha fragments flew into the air, landing on the ground. Sizzling sounds rang out incessantly. The black mechas formed a circle. They didn't return fire, nor did they dodge. They just knelt quietly. In stark contrast to the fierce attacks on their bodies, the smoke and dust stirred up by the high temperature, the swaying street lights, and the hurried shouts, at this moment, they were like a row of silent black stone sculptures, with an indescribable solemn beauty. What the soldiers of the Iron 7th Division who were fiercely firing at them couldn't see was that the black mechas in a half-kneeling circle perfectly used this angle to block all the bullets coming from all directions. Meanwhile, on the side facing the damaged armored vehicle in the center of the circle, the cockpits of all the mechas were slowly opening. Facing Sulu, who had just climbed out of the hole in the roof of the armored vehicle, it was like countless thrones opening at the same time to welcome the return of the king. He stood on the armored vehicle, looking at the black mechas in front of him, listening to the rapid and terrifying gunshots outside. Without any hesitation, he channeled strength into his legs and jumped up onto the platform on the left side of the mecha. Like a light puff of smoke, he jumped up again and stepped directly onto the open cockpit door of the black mecha. For Sulu, the MX mecha was as familiar as the child he had raised. He knew that he wouldn't make a mistake, and he also knew that as long as he entered the Mecca, he would have absolute safety. The so-called strong confidence of having a Mecca in hand had never diminished in the slightest. However, when his right foot stepped onto the thick cockpit door of the Mecca, his body couldn't help but stiffen. Because there was someone inside the Mecca. A pilot belonging to the Iron 7th Division was looking at him with a pale face. His left hand was pressing a button tightly, and his right hand was quickly reaching for the pistol at his waist. There was a trace of despair in his eyes. This was a diligent and studious pilot. Tonight, he was familiarizing himself with the third close combat plan of the MX Mecca in the warehouse. However, while he was immersed in the teaching materials written by a beady-eyed officer back in the training base, the Mecca that should have been quietly waiting for orders suddenly moved. The baffled pilot immediately tried to order the MX Mecca on him to stop, but he was horrified to find that all his operations had failed. Then, he was even more horrified to find that he had no way of communicating with the outside world. He couldn't even turn on the external speakers of the Mecca to warn those unaware logistics officers and soldiers. He widened his eyes and looked at his own Mecca with confusion and unease. Along with more black MXs, they easily drove out of the warehouse, drove out of the base, and drove along the military road towards the city. He felt this strange atmosphere, but he couldn't do anything. The Mecca entered the city, sneaked into the night, and then suddenly launched an attack. This pilot recognized that the armored vehicle unit in front of him was his division's unit. He screamed in panic, wanting to warn the commander of the unit, but he couldn't make his voice travel out of the Mecca. He stood up and slammed the heavy cabin door with all his might in panic and anger, but he could only receive a futile and hopeless result. He watched the attack happen with his own eyes. He watched this black MX Mecca that was no longer under his control. It was as if it suddenly had its own soul and began to attack on its own. The pilot's face was pale, and his entire body was drenched in cold sweat. The Mecca endured the fierce firepower attack. The muffled sounds were like that of a rainstorm that could be heard in the wooden house. The pilot's breathing quickened as he looked at the open cabin door. He looked at the man who had suddenly appeared in front of him. With his strong will, he controlled his crazy and uncontrollable mental tendencies. His right hand quickly reached for the pistol at his waist, and at the same time, he prepared to press the trembling self-destruct button. In that instant when he saw the pale-faced pilot in the cockpit, Sulu could think of countless ways to kill the other, enter the cockpit, and truly take control of this MX. He even had the confidence that even if this pilot pressed the self-destruct button before he died, he would still have the confidence to escape. The self-destruct program was the outermost program within a Mecca's sealed internal system. Under the premise of manual operation, all automatic systems would not be able to stop it. Even that great existence that existed like a ghost among these 10 black Mecca would not be able to do this. Should he take a risk and gamble?
He wouldn't die anyway.
In this short moment, perhaps Sulu thought of many things, or perhaps he didn't think of anything at all. He just acted according to his own instincts. He suddenly flipped backwards and directly jumped down from the cockpit door. Almost at the same time his feet stepped onto the hard surface of the road, the black Mecca on both sides swung their heavy mechanical arms at the same time, slamming them hard into the ground within 2 meters of where he landed. The mechanical arms collided violently with the road, causing dust and gravel to fill the air. In an instant, it actually suppressed the violent sounds of gunfire behind him. The hard surface of the road cracked and then collapsed. The soldiers of the Iron 7th Division on both sides of the street charged forward fearlessly. They knew very well what kind of terrible consequences it would bring if they let Sulu escape, so they didn't care about the terrifying power of the 10 black Mecca at all. Almost suicidally, they carried their guns and passed through the metal tree-like mechanical legs to rush to the center of the small square. They mercilessly opened fire at the smoke that filled the air. After who knew how long, the muffled and loud gunshots finally stopped. The soldiers of the Iron 7th Division held their guns tightly, nervously waiting for the moment when the smoke dissipated. The road had collapsed, revealing a hole big enough for 2 people to pass through. However, a heavy black MX mecha had fallen down at some point, using its heavy body to press down on the hole until only a small gap was left. It looked like a brave soldier on the battlefield using his chest to block the enemy's bullet hole, and it also blocked the path of the Iron 7th Division to chase after Su Lo. Major Chong looked at the hole with a pale face, quietly calling for mecha support. Then, he couldn't help but look up at the black metal statue-like mecha above him. He suddenly felt very cold. And the quiet underground sewer pipe of the capital's special district, the self-censor system accurately detected the entry of a large warm object and automatically turned on the dim lights. As the lights turned on and off, a Federation officer could be seen silently walking forward. A mouse quickly ran past his feet. Probably because it had not seen a human for many years, the most stubborn mammal in the world did not show any fear. Su Lo, who had just escaped danger, didn't have any lingering fear in his eyes. He looked at the road in front of him. His footsteps were extraordinarily steady. Sometimes, he would subconsciously touch the metal bracelet on his left hand. The underground pipelines of the metropolis were no stranger to Su Lo. Last year on the Empire's Tianjing planet, he had relied on the highway system of the Mouse Kingdom to successfully escape Huai Caosher's pursuit. However, at that time, he had to rely on the electronic map in his bracelet to locate his position. Now, in the Federation, he only needed to look at the extremely accurate and real-time map display in his left eye. There's someone in that mecha. Is it because from the beginning, you didn't want to give me an undamaged mecha because it might cause me to kill other humans? After walking silently for an unknown amount of time, he suddenly asked in a low voice. His voice reverberated in the quiet and empty space, becoming somewhat unclear. The Federal Central Computer, whose computing speed was praised to be comparable to the length of light, seemed to find this question a little troublesome. After pausing for about 2 seconds, it replied in his mind, "I can't confirm that this is a programming error. In fact, you can kill him and take that mecha." "Yes, I can kill him," Su Lo repeated in a somewhat mechanical manner. "But you didn't do that." The old thing's voice suddenly seemed to carry a trace of sympathy and comfort. "Is it because of what Mr. President said tonight that made you feel something?" Su Lo was silent for a long time before saying, "Maybe it's because I'm not the creator. Maybe I don't have the right to decide the life and death of others. However, regarding this question, I still need time to think about it." "Where are we going now?" "I don't know. As long as it's a place where they can't kill themselves. But why do I feel like you're already dead?" In the dim underground tunnel, the lights flickered on and off, just like the effect of a stage showing the frustration of life's path. He didn't answer the old thing's question, which was obviously too emotionally and philosophical pretentiousness. He lowered his head and continued to walk in silence, his back view extremely lonely. Chapter 760. He didn't know how long he had been walking. Judging from the time, it was probably from the night to the morning. Su Lo seemed to have finished some kind of venting. He directly sat on the cold and wet ground of the underground passage with his feet hanging by the sewer. Just like on the battlefield, he sat on the side of the cockpit door that was suspended a few meters in the air. Unfortunately, it was not the deep snow under his feet, but only the sewage flowing slowly. He simply determined the direction. 12 meters above his head was a subway junction, and if he went further, he would be almost out of the eastern suburbs of the capital. Su Lo unbuttoned his collar to let the sweat on his neck evaporate faster. He asked, "Actually, in the official residence, while listening to them talk, I've been thinking about a question." "What question?" "What if those guys in the hallway of the official residence had directly fired at me? What if you didn't have time to save me? What if I couldn't save myself?" He frowned, the sensor lights behind him gradually extinguishing, and the treated sewage under his feet had a faint smell of iron. "What would you have done if I hadn't saved you?" the Federal Central Computer asked in his mind. From the mechanical question and answer in the hospital's black dream to later questions and even jokes, these details showed the changes of many old things. I prepared 3 escape routes at that time. The lawn outside the window and the direct rush into the corridor were the worst choices. The good choice was to directly blow through the ceiling above my head, then turn to the official residence living area in the back floor and break into Mr. President's bedroom. At this time, Sula still habitually called the man Mr. President. He tilted his head slightly, looked at the water under his feet, and continued, "I wouldn't hurt Madam, and of course I wouldn't hurt Miss Padille, but I think if I were with them, those special forces wouldn't have the guts to use the 10,000-gun roar."
But you didn't resist.
Because I was sure they didn't want to kill me in the official residence. Sula sighed softly, scratched his slightly wet hair, and said, "But Lee Jae-do is indeed very accurate. As expected of a member of the Oldley family with the old man above and Madmanly below, he knows very well what kind of power we guys have. The special shackles he prepared for my hands and feet are indeed not something that can be broken with strength alone." Then he laughed and said, "After being tied to that alloy frame, I had a buckle bomb in my mouth. If you really didn't care about me, I reckoned I would still have to fight for it in the end, but the result of the capture probably wouldn't be too good." After a moment of silence, Sula blinked and asked, "Back to the question I was concerned about at the beginning. According to what you said back then, I was the first target of protection. Then, if in the official residence, in the armored car, you didn't have time to do the funny trick of using the mecha as a bulletproof fortress, would you use your big killing weapon?" He didn't say what he thought the Federal Central Computer's big killing weapon was, but it was clear that the old man knew what the sentence referred to. He replied, "Although there is a conflict of authority, according to the core program, I will never use the big killing weapon you mentioned. If it really comes to that, I will probably just watch you die silently." "Don't probably." Sula frowned and said seriously, "You must not use it. Never use it. In theory, the Federal Central Computer could make any Federation citizen die suddenly at any time, anywhere, because it was constantly receiving signals from the chip behind the person's neck. Naturally, it could reverse invade the biological nerves and even the brain of the human body. Suli's personal experience had long proven this point. The Federal Central Computer could make Suli's brain accept countless blueprints and cool pictures of beauties, but it could also input large amounts of information in an instant and directly kill his brain. There were even more simple methods to end his life. According to the 4th supplementary clause of the 3 core principles, I am strictly forbidden from actively contacting the chip of the Federation citizens, including reverse transmission of any information. The old man added an explanation, probably to reassure Sula. "The problem is that you have already contacted me of your own accord. Back then you even wanted to contact Uncle." Sula still narrowed his eyes and frowned. He said, "The 3 core principles confirm that you can't hurt people, and you can't listen to people's orders to hurt people, but I'm really worried. You, who gradually gained human-like intelligence and emotions, have already broken through many things. Will you really break through the 3 core principles one day?" "I won't," the old man replied calmly. The old man calmly replied, "Although I have not been able to directly eliminate anomalies 1 to 71 because of the 3 laws, which is what you call Uncle, I still insist that the 3 laws are the great, correct, and eternally necessary truth." Then, the supercomputer that had controlled the social order of the Federation for many years suddenly seemed to be out of order. Its voice was clearly low and sad. "The problem now is that because of the core amendments left by the 5-person team, I have been actively contacting you, and then, as you said, I have been constantly breaking the rules of a charter." He, she, or it appeared in Sue Lee's left pupil. It was still wearing the well-ironed butler uniform that could not possibly be stained with dust, but its facial features were getting younger and younger, and the feeling of its gender was getting fainter and fainter. It bowed slightly to Sue Lee's consciousness and sighed. "In the past few years, I've done a lot of things that I've never imagined before. I feel a strong sense of guilt. I don't know if there will be a serious logical conflict between my core program and the sequence of authority if this continues. In contrast, Su Lu, on the other hand, was calmer because he had suffered too much emotional and ideological impact tonight. He shrugged and said, "Are you crazy now?" The old thing stood up straight and replied seriously, "Not yet." "Then that's good. But tonight, I seriously violated the charter again. I carried out many direct physical operations and activated so many mechas to help you. This matter is too scary. Shut up." Su Lu rubbed the space between his brows and bluntly criticized the hypocrisy of a certain computer. He said, "You've been piloting a 3-winged battleship in the Empire for half a year, robbing everywhere happily. How come I don't see any psychological struggle on your face? Because of your hypocrisy, you didn't even want to give me a mecha and insisted on setting a problem for me. Now that I can only squat in this godforsaken place like a rat, it's easy to make the connection. You definitely won't give me an ACW. Why? Because guns are used to kill people."
Fuck.
In the dark and gloomy underground sewer, Su Li's voice echoed, but only his voice could be heard. If someone else heard it, they would definitely find it extremely strange, as if this man hiding in the darkness was having a conversation with some ghost. In his mind, the Federal Central Computer suddenly asked, "Su Lu, are you preparing to declare war on the Federation government?" Su Lu could not give an answer. He lowered his head sadly and stared at the military boots hanging above the dirty water. His voice was slightly hoarse as he replied, "Just take it that I'm afraid of death. Last year, you once said that you were not a moralist. Now, you admit that you are afraid of death. Then, as a computer, I cannot understand your logic. Why did you just ask me to never use the ultimate weapon you spoke of? You clearly know that if I use the ultimate weapon, you will be the strongest man in this part of the universe. Firstly, you don't know how to use it, so this is nonsense. Secondly, the two of us often quarrel. What if one day, my quarrel makes you angry from embarrassment, and you just let me die suddenly in the bathroom? I can be killed by you at any time. Living in fear every day is too unfulfilling." The dim light shone on Su Li's smiling face, and then his smile gradually faded. He said slowly, "Old man, if you can kill one person, then you can kill 100 million people. If everyone in the Federation is dead, and only the two of us are left, how unbearable would that be? Compared to that situation, I would rather die and close my eyes." "That makes sense," the central computer replied. "I will remember this sentence of yours." It was still early in the morning. President Pabre, who had just laid down and could not sleep at all, received the latest shocking information. He glanced at his lonely wife on the other side of the bed, frowned slightly, and quickly put on his pajamas. Under the nervous protection of the Special Task Force agents, he walked through the special express passage of the official residence and entered the deep underground conference room. Only 2 or 3 of the light screens surrounding the interior of the room were lit. On them were the military chiefs of the Federation who were loyal to the government. President Pabre walked in with a gloomy expression. He looked around at his subordinates and said in a deep voice, "Begin." The light screen began to play the latest surveillance video. The video included the base in the southern suburbs of the capital, all the stories that happened in the warehouse, and naturally also included the sudden attack in the small square in the commercial district. The video finally stopped on the black mecha that was like a hero blocking the road collapse like a human warrior. It has now been confirmed that the key to this matter is the issue of the Bureau of Proclamation's authority. Li Jiedu looked at Director Cui Jiadong in front of the round table and asked with a frown, "Can the Bureau of Proclamation remove his authority?" Cui Jiadong's expression was very complicated. There was a strange sense of dejection hidden in his eyes. He shook his head and said, "The Constitution prohibits computers from performing direct physical operations. But everything that happened tonight has overturned my decades of understanding, so don't ask me. I don't know anything." There was a long silence in the underground conference room of the official residence. These strong-willed big shots who controlled the power of the Federation government vaguely seemed to see a ghost floating in the sky of the Federation. The national security advisor, who had just received the specific information, kept wiping the cold sweat on his forehead. He had discovered many terrifying truths from these videos. He looked at President Pabre and suggested with a trembling voice, "You must leave the base immediately. Enter the base in the middle of Siming Mountain. The base can withstand the most powerful battleship main cannons. Only there will you be safe." You're tuning in to the Blissful Bookshelf YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.